In the stillness of a world that once trembled at his name, the legacy of Carlo Gambino lingers like a ghost, haunting the very streets he ruled. But in the silence of his absence, a question echoes: who, if anyone, can fill the void left by the whispering assassin? Carlo Gambino sat quietly at the kitchen table, his small fingers pressed against the smooth surface of a wooden spoon. His eyes, darker than the night sky above his Sicilian village, followed his father as he moved in and out of the shadows, never quite visible, never fully heard. The kitchen, dimly lit by a single hanging bulb, held a strange stillness, the kind that only found its home in places where secrets were shared in whispers. In the distance, the rhythmic sound of hammers echoed from the courtyard, where men, hardened by years of quiet labor, worked under the direction of his uncles. Their voices were low, their movements swift. Everything about them spoke of a life Carlo couldn't fully understand yet, but one he would soon learn to master. His father was a quiet man, tall and broad-shouldered, a figure carved out of patience and restraint. He spoke rarely, but when he did, it was with purpose. Carlo watched him closely, studying the way he moved with a grace that seemed out of place for a man who made his living in the shadows of society. He understood that there was power in silence. That, more than anything else, was the lesson he would carry with him into the future. Power didn't scream, it whispered. It moved when no one expected it, and it left behind an unmistakable trail of respect and fear. On the rare occasions when Carlo's father would sit beside him, he would share a few words, small, measured truths that never made sense at the time but would later echo in his mind with clarity. "The world will always remember the noise, boy," his father would say, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "But it's the quiet ones who own it." Carlo's family was a complex web of influence, men who came and went, some with smiles on their faces and others with cold eyes that never met yours. They were the kind of men who understood the power of a nod, a handshake, a slight tilt of the head. These men moved like shadows, always present, never intrusive. To a child, the world they inhabited seemed far too large, too dangerous, and yet there was an undeniable allure to it, the way they never seemed rushed, never anxious. They moved at their own pace, taking what they needed and leaving behind only the slightest trace of their existence. Carlo would sneak peeks at their faces, memorizing their expressions, watching how they held themselves with the kind of quiet confidence that made you believe they knew something you didn't, and that was the power Carlo would one day wield. He understood that silence spoke louder than words, and that the art of moving, unseen, unheard, was where true control lay. In the years to come, Carlo would master this art, becoming not just a shadow in the world he inhabited, but the one who commanded the shadows to move when he willed it. And so, as the kitchen light flickered and the sounds of the night grew distant, Carlo Gambino began to understand the most important lesson of all. Those who could make themselves invisible would one day hold the power to shape the world. Carlo Gambino's world shifted the day he stepped into the fold of the Gambino family. The scent of cigar smoke, leather, and the faintest hint of fear hung in the air, familiar to him but now more vivid than ever. He was no longer a boy under the watchful eyes of his father's silent influence. He was a man, and the streets had a way of pulling men deeper than they could ever imagine. Carlo moved with an easy grace, a quiet presence that betrayed none of the anxiety most would feel entering a world as raw and unpredictable as organized crime. His uncles, men who had spent their lives navigating the delicate balance between loyalty and power, showed him the ropes in ways that were as subtle as they were brutal. He wasn't rushed. He wasn't pushed into the chaos of violence, but it was always just a step away. Carlo had always watched his father's quiet strength, but now he observed the methods of men who carried both fear and respect in equal measure. The stories were often whispered, the lessons taught with a nod or a glance, never in grand speeches. It was the kind of education that seeped into the soul, never to be forgotten. Loyalty was the bedrock of the family, but loyalty was also a currency that could be bought, traded, or broken. Carlo learned early that in this world, actions spoke louder than words, and sometimes those actions were violent, swift, and without mercy. He watched as men who had once been friends became enemies in the blink of an eye, their bonds severed with the cold precision of a knife. He didn't flinch. He didn't turn away. Instead, he watched, understanding that violence was a tool, not a display of emotion. It was necessary, not personal. There was something about how his mentors moved, how they made decisions with the ease of men who had long ago accepted that the world was built on strength and silence. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. Every interaction, every meeting, was a calculated move. A raised eyebrow meant a death sentence. A tilt of the head could seal a deal, and a handshake was often more binding than a signed contract. Carlo never questioned the way things worked. He simply absorbed. The men around him spoke little, but they taught him everything he needed to know. They showed him the delicate dance of respect, fear, and control. And they showed him that loyalty, in the end, was a currency that could be spent, but it was also something that could be quietly taken away. He watched them navigate this delicate web of power, and he learned from it, not with questions, not with doubt, but with the sharp, silent observation of a man who knew that his time would come. In the quiet hours after the meetings, when the last of the whiskey bottles were emptied and the cigars were snuffed out, Carlo stood alone. He understood something that would define him for the rest of his life. He wasn't here to be seen, to be heard. He was here to take control, to bend the world around him in silence, and to become, in the end, the kind of man who made others whisper his name. Carlo Gambino's reputation began to grow, slowly at first, like the quiet pull of a storm gathering on the horizon. He didn't rush to make a name for himself. He didn't need to. There was something magnetic about the way he moved, a calmness that set him apart from the brash, louder men around him. Where others barked orders, Carlo spoke only when necessary, and even then, his words were precise, measured. He had learned early that silence, more than anything else, carried weight in this world. It could make a man listen when no one else would. It could also make a man fear when no one else dared. The first true lesson came from a veteran mafioso who had seen it all. A man named Vincenzo, known as the Quiet, had lived through wars, betrayals, and 100 whispered promises, each one broken or sealed with blood. He was the kind of man who had spent decades at the table, watching deals being made and unmade with the quiet precision of a surgeon. Vincenzo never raised his voice, never let emotion cloud his judgment. His power came from the same quiet force that Carlo was beginning to master, the ability to make others think, make them bend, without ever needing to raise a hand. Under Vincenzo's watchful eye, Carlo learned the art of negotiation. It wasn't just about the money or the terms. It was about controlling the moment, about making people see what you wanted them to see without ever saying it outright. It was about forcing choices on your opponent without them even realizing they had none. Vincenzo taught him that the key to true power wasn't in what you took, but in what you allowed others to believe they still had. The first time Carlo sat at the table, the weight of the decision before him felt almost impossible to bear. The room was silent, except for the clinking of glasses and the occasional shuffle of cards. A man named Bruno, known for his erratic temper and impulsive decisions, sat across from Carlo, glaring at him as though daring him to make the wrong move. But Carlo didn't flinch. He watched Bruno closely, reading his every tick, his every subtle shift of weight. The moment Bruno spoke, Carlo knew that he was already one step ahead. Bruno was desperate to control the deal, but Carlo wasn't here to fight for control. He was here to take it. With a few quiet words, Carlo shifted the balance of power. Bruno didn't even know it was happening until it was too late. The terms changed, the agreement was set, and Bruno walked away with nothing but his pride wounded. Carlo didn't need to raise his voice or make threats. The deal had been made, and Bruno knew he'd lost before he ever realized the game had started. It was in that moment, as the others at the table raised their glasses in quiet acknowledgement, that Carlo understood what true power felt like. It wasn't in the loud explosions of force, but in the quiet, calculated moments when you could bend the world to your will, without anyone knowing how or when it had happened. Carlo Gambino's first steps on American soil were a quiet affair, unnoticed by the bustling crowd around him. The city of New York was an entirely different world from the quiet hills of Sicily, where he'd learned the art of moving unseen. The streets here buzzed with a frenetic energy, a clamor of voices and the harsh sound of carriages and later, cars. The air smelled of coal and ambition, a sharp contrast to the scent of salt water and olive trees he had known so well. But even amid the noise, Carlo could feel the pulse of the streets, a rhythm that wasn't so different from the one he had left behind. Here, too, whispers held power. Here, too, men made their moves without ever raising their voices. The Gambino family had come to America not by accident, but by design. The decision was one carefully weighed by Carlo's uncles, who understood that the world in Sicily had become too small, too dangerous for their ambitions. America was the land of opportunity, yes, but also the land of power waiting to be seized. Carlo's father had seen it in the shadows of the New York docks, the same opportunities to build, to control, that he had known back home. The family moved with a quiet certainty, keeping to the shadows, their true intentions masked by the noise and chaos of their new home. In the crowded streets of New York, Carlo learned quickly that the rules were the same, but the stakes were higher. The old Sicilian ways of quiet strength, of letting actions speak louder than words, were just as necessary here. But the men who moved through these streets were different, faster, louder, and with an ever-present desperation to climb higher, faster. Carlo took it all in, without flinching. He watched the Italians, the Irish, the Jews, each group carving their own piece of this new world. Everyone was fighting for something, but Carlo knew that the fight was less about brawn and more about brains. New York was a place where noise was cheap and silence was valuable. Carlo had come from a place where power was whispered in alleyways, where decisions were made with the smallest of gestures, and that was the world he would continue to navigate. He didn't need to shout to be heard. He didn't need to fight to prove his strength. Carlo understood that in this city, it wasn't about making the loudest threat. It was about making the right one, the one that would force others to listen without ever needing to say a word. As the months passed, Carlo's presence began to be felt, not because he pushed himself forward, but because he moved like the quiet shadow in the corner of a room, watching and listening. And in a city as loud as New York, where everyone was shouting for attention, Carlo learned that the most powerful thing a man could do was stay quiet and wait. Carlo's first job in the United States was a simple one, or so it seemed at first. A man named Tony, a small-time player in the neighborhood, had made the mistake of running his mouth about the Gambino family. Word had spread that Tony was trying to set up a rival operation, trying to cut into the family's territory. It wasn't the kind of offense that warranted an immediate explosion of violence. Instead, it required something far more effective: precision. This was Carlo's initiation, a test of his ability to observe, wait, and make the right move at the right time. He was given the task by his uncles, men who had seen the hard edges of violence too many times to be moved by it now. They didn't need a display of force. They needed a quiet solution, the kind of work Carlo had been watching his entire life. The message was simple: send a signal, but don't make a scene. Make sure Tony knew that the Gambino family was watching, that his actions had consequences, but do it in a way that left no mark, no body, no blood, just fear. enough to make him reconsider his next move. The plan wasn't complicated, but it required patience. Carlo followed Tony for days, moving like a shadow through the city, watching his every step. He noted his habits, the places he went, the people he talked to. Tony was sloppy. He was in the wrong places, making the wrong deals, too eager to move up without understanding the weight of the men he was trying to challenge. Carlo knew that a direct confrontation wouldn't work, not yet. He had to plant a seed, something that would grow in Tony's mind, twisting his sense of security until it withered. In the end, the job was completed with a quiet efficiency that surprised even Carlo. He found Tony alone in a back alley, close enough for a final warning but far enough from any witnesses. A few words, a small gesture to make Tony understand that the world he was trying to step into was far more dangerous than he realized. No threats, no violence, just a moment where time seemed to freeze, and Tony could feel the weight of the message without anyone needing to say another word. The next day, Tony was nowhere to be found. No one knew exactly what had happened, but it was clear that the warning had hit its mark. He had been too afraid to make a move against the Gambino family, and the silence around his disappearance was louder than any gunshot could have been. For Carlo, the job was more than a test. It was a lesson in patience. He learned that true power wasn't in the ability to take action quickly, but in knowing when to wait. He had made his first step in the world of the mafia, and in doing so, he had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that patience, not violence, would carry him further than he ever could have imagined. It was a lesson he would carry with him through every step of his rise, one that would define him in the years to come. The mafia was a world of loud men, their boasts echoing through the streets, their bravado as much a part of their identity as the scars they carried. Yet, Carlo quickly learned that the real power in the underworld didn't come from the loudest voice in the room, but from the men who didn't need to raise theirs at all. The silent men, as they were called, moved through life unnoticed, their influence stretching far and wide without a single sound to announce their presence. They weren't feared because of their strength or their threats. They were feared because they could make things happen without anyone ever knowing they were involved. Carlo adopted this philosophy as his own. He studied the silent men around him, men whose names were barely spoken but whose reputations reverberated across the city. They didn't need to stand at the front of a room or make grand speeches. They were always in the background, the ones pulling strings, the ones who made decisions from the shadows. And in a world where noise often meant weakness, silence was power. He embraced it, and in doing so, he began to shape his own identity in the same image. He was a man who did not need to be seen to be heard. His presence was felt not through grand gestures, but through the careful steps he took, the decisions made with a quiet confidence that left others wondering how he'd managed to get so much done without ever breaking a sweat. Carlo's rise was slow, but it was steady. Where others shouted for respect, Carlo demanded it with the smallest of actions. He didn't enter rooms with force. He entered them with intent. His eyes studied, his mind calculated. Every move, every gesture, was part of a larger plan, a plan that unfolded so quietly that no one even realized they had been moved until it was too late. His reputation began to grow, not as a man of violence, but as a man of consequence. People began to whisper about him, not in fear of what he would do, but in fear of what might happen if he didn't do anything at all. As the months passed, Carlo's quiet demeanor started to carve out a place for him in the mafia hierarchy. His ability to remain unseen but ever present gave him an edge that few could match. He didn't need to be at the center of every conversation to be in control. He wasn't interested in being the loudest voice in the room. He was content to sit in the corner, observing, listening, waiting for the moment when his influence would become undeniable. It was this calm, this ability to remain unshaken, that gained him the respect and, eventually, the fear of those around him. Carlo Gambino wasn't just another mafioso. He was something far more dangerous. He was a silent man, and in the world he inhabited, that was the deadliest thing of all. Carlo's reputation had begun to ripple through the underworld, but it wasn't until his first true test as an assassin that he solidified his place among the elite. The job was simple in its execution, but its impact would be felt long after the deed was done. A rival boss, one who had made the mistake of underestimating the Gambino family, had made a move that couldn't go unpunished. His name had become a whisper on the lips of those who feared him, but Carlo was already a step ahead. The job wasn't about retaliation, it was about sending a message. It was a job that demanded silence, precision, and an understanding that the less anyone knew, the better. Carlo's approach was methodical. He observed the rival's routine, learning the smallest details, the places he frequented, the time he spent with family, the gaps in his security. It wasn't about brute force. Carlo understood that the best assassins didn't rely on weapons alone. They relied on timing, on patience, on becoming a shadow that never gave the game away. His movements were calculated, his mind focused entirely on the task at hand. He wasn't rushing to get it over with. He was savoring the moment when the kill would come, when he would erase this man from existence with nothing more than a whisper. The night of the hit, Carlo was already inside the building, the echo of his footsteps muffled by the shadows. He'd slipped in unnoticed, blending with the city's heartbeat, becoming part of the landscape. He had no need for a flashy weapon, no need for chaos. The knife was small, almost delicate, but in Carlo's hands, it was a thing of precision. As the target entered his private office, unaware of the danger lurking just feet away, Carlo was already moving. The hit was swift, 2 strikes, and the man was gone before his body even hit the floor. There was no shouting, no struggle, just the clean sound of an enemy falling without a sound. In the quiet aftermath, Carlo wiped the knife clean, disappeared back into the night, and was gone before anyone realized what had happened. The job was perfect. No witnesses, no chaos, no trace of his presence. Carlo's name wasn't spoken for days, but whispers began to circulate in the underworld. A man who could strike without anyone knowing he had even been there, that was the kind of power people feared. Carlo had done his work so efficiently that it left no room for doubt. He had become a ghost, a shadow, someone whose presence was only felt when it was too late to stop him. And with that clean, silent kill, Carlo Gambino earned a new nickname, a name that would be passed down in the dark corners of New York, a name that would follow him through every whispered conversation, the Whispering Assassin. As Carlo's influence grew, so too did his role in the unseen machinery of the mafia. No longer was he just a figure on the streets, carrying out jobs with a quiet precision. Now, he was part of the conversations that shaped the underworld itself, conversations that took place behind closed doors, away from the prying eyes of the public. These were the meetings that could shift the balance of power in an instant, where men like Carlo Gambino held the room without ever raising their voices. The first time he entered one of these meetings, he noticed how little was said. The air was thick with tension, not from arguments, but from unspoken understanding. The men around the table didn't need to shout or make grand gestures. They were men of power, and their words held weight simply because they were spoken. Carlo learned quickly that it wasn't the loudest man who commanded respect. It was the man who made others listen when he spoke. And Carlo, with his unassuming nature, fit perfectly into this role. It wasn't long before Carlo found himself in the thick of these high-stakes negotiations, sitting across from powerful men who held entire empires in their palms. The discussions were never about money. It was about control, about positioning, about who would come out on top when the dust settled. But it wasn't just about what was said. It was about what was left unsaid. Every silence, every subtle shift in posture, carried meaning. Carlo learned to read these men not by their words, but by the spaces in between them. He watched how they shifted their eyes when certain topics were raised, how they flinched when a name was mentioned. These were the signs of men who were afraid, even if they didn't show it on the surface. In these meetings, Carlo's power wasn't in what he said it was, in how his silence spoke louder than words. He didn't need to argue, didn't need to posture. His mere presence at the table was enough to shift the power dynamic. When Carlo spoke, it wasn't just his words people listened to. It was the weight of what they represented. His quiet, deliberate speech made people pause because they understood that his words weren't just casual talk, they were commands wrapped in diplomacy. Carlo soon came to understand the importance of fear in maintaining control. Fear wasn't about brute strength or public acts of violence. It was about creating an aura of unpredictability, a sense that at any moment, things could change. It was about loyalty, too, not the kind that came with threats or intimidation, but the kind that came from respect, from understanding the lengths one man would go to for another. Carlo wasn't a man to be feared for his actions. He was feared for the knowledge that his decisions could alter the course of anyone's life with a single word. And in these meetings, with these men who knew how to navigate the world of shadows, Carlo had learned to speak without saying anything at all. The underworld of New York was a vast web of interconnected power, and Carlo had learned early on that it wasn't always about eliminating rivals. Sometimes, the key to survival was finding a way to coexist with those who could just as easily be an enemy as an ally. It was a delicate balance, a tightrope walk that only a few could manage without falling. When Carlo found himself sitting across the table from members of the Genovese family, it wasn't with the intent to destroy. It was to survive. And to do that, sometimes you needed to form an unlikely alliance. The meeting was set in the quietest of places, an old, dimly lit restaurant on the edge of Little Italy, where the clink of silverware was drowned out by the hum of murmured conversations. Carlo had no intention of making a spectacle of this encounter. No grand speeches, no threats, just business. The Genovese family had their own ambitions, and for the first time, their goals aligned with Carlo's. The tension in the room was palpable, but Carlo didn't flinch. He had learned long ago that silence was often the most powerful tool in a negotiation, especially when dealing with men who thrived on control and fear. The deal was simple in its premise. It wasn't a partnership of equals, not exactly. Carlo's family still held the upper hand in many respects, but it was a delicate understanding between two powerful forces, each with enough respect for the other to know where the line was drawn. There was no room for ego here. This was about the future. The two families, once bitter enemies, would work together to handle the increasing pressure from law enforcement. They would share information, divide territories, and most importantly, stay silent. The deal wasn't just about money. It was about survival in a world where the stakes were as high as a man's life. What made the deal rare wasn't the terms, it was the trust. For Carlo, trust was never given freely. It was something that had to be earned, something that could be shattered in a heartbeat. Yet here he was, sitting in a room where the tension didn't just come from the unspoken words, but from a shared understanding that only those who had spent years in the shadows could comprehend. The Genovese men weren't his friends. They were rivals. But for this brief moment, they were allies. And in the world they inhabited, that was a rare thing. As they shook hands and sealed the deal, there was no fanfare, no grand gestures, just the silent acknowledgement that they had crossed a line together, one that neither could afford to ignore. In the quietest of ways, Carlo had forged a bond with a family that had once been his fiercest adversary, and though it would remain a fragile alliance, it was one built on the understanding that silence and secrecy was the true currency of power. Carlo had always understood that information was power, but in the world he inhabited, It wasn't about how much you knew, it was about how you used it, and more importantly, how you kept it to yourself. The art of silence wasn't just about not speaking. It was about knowing when to listen, when to observe, and when to act, without ever revealing your hand. Carlo's skill in gathering secrets, in finding the threads that connected people, businesses, and events, made him an invaluable asset to the family. While others were quick to boast of their connections or make threats, Carlo operated in the background, quietly collecting the puzzle pieces that others were too loud to notice. He began to realize that the power wasn't just in having the information, it was in controlling who knew what, and more crucially, who didn't. The family, once hesitant, had come to rely on him for this quiet form of control. Carlo wasn't a man of grand gestures or flashy acts of violence. His power lay in the spaces between words, in the stillness of his presence. He knew who was loyal, who was greedy, who could be trusted, and who could not, but he never spoke of it. He simply acted when it was necessary, making moves that others didn't even see coming. Carlo's reputation grew not from the jobs he completed or the rivals he eliminated, but from the quiet way he held the reins of the family's empire. He wasn't a capo, but he was something more valuable, the keeper of secrets. Men in the family would come to him with problems, and he would listen, never interrupting, never offering solutions immediately. He simply absorbed the information, allowing the weight of the words to sink in before moving in a way that would shift the situation in the family's favor. He knew how to manipulate information as much as he knew how to manipulate people. What fascinated Carlo most was how little others understood about the true power of secrets. The family respected him not just for his ability to gather information, but for his rare ability to say nothing at all. He had learned that knowing everything and revealing nothing was the ultimate form of control. He didn't need to flaunt his knowledge. The very fact that he held it made him dangerous. As long as he kept his cards close, no one could make a move without Carlo knowing the consequences long before they did. And in the end, that was the key to power. It wasn't in the noise or the bloodshed. It was in the calm, the silence, and the certainty that no one could make a move without Carlo being one step ahead. The family, without realizing it, had made him indispensable. And as long as they kept relying on him, Carlo would remain the one with the greatest control, not through brute force, but through the careful holding of the most powerful weapon of all: secrets. As the Gambino family's influence grew, so did the envy of the other crime families. The more power they gained, the more it seemed that other families, once wary of Carlo's quiet strength, began to test the limits of that power. They pushed in subtle ways, smaller encroachments on territory, business deals that undercut Gambino interests, whispers in the street. The tensions simmered, barely noticeable on the surface, but Carlo could feel it in the air. It was only a matter of time before it would erupt, but Carlo wasn't one for open confrontation. He had no desire for grand gestures or public showdowns. His strength was in the shadows, and that's where he intended to keep the war. While the others made their moves in the open, Carlo set to work in silence. He watched, waited, and calculated. He knew that direct conflict would only play into the hands of those who thrived on spectacle. Instead, he built a quiet war, one with no headlines, no explosions, and no bodies in the street. It would be a war of whispers, of alliances made and broken, of subtle shifts in power that would leave his rivals scrambling without even knowing what hit them. He never revealed his plans, not to anyone. He kept everything close, tucked inside the folds of his mind, sharing only what was necessary with his trusted men. He planted seeds where they would grow into something far more destructive. A man would disappear, and the story would never fully make sense. A shipment would be hijacked, but no one would know who the true culprits were. Slowly, his rivals began to feel the effects of a war they couldn't understand. While they fumbled in the light, Carlo moved in the shadows. Each of his steps was a calculated response, one that shifted the balance of power just slightly enough to weaken their grip, enough to cause doubt. He quietly fed information to the right people, creating small rifts between the families. Each move seemed innocent enough: an overheard conversation, a deal gone bad, a betrayal from within. But when the pieces began to fall into place, it became clear to those watching that this was no accident. The quiet war took months to fully unfold, but when it did, it was devastating. Rival families, once confident in their dominance, found themselves scrambling to protect what little they had left. Trust crumbled, alliances fractured, and a wave of fear began to ripple through the streets. Carlo had orchestrated the entire thing without ever lifting a finger. The blood that was spilled wasn't his to shed. It was the blood of those who had been too loud, too brash to realize the real power in this world was not in the gun, but in the mind that pulled the strings. The Gambino family emerged unscathed, their grip on New York tighter than ever. Carlo had won the war, not through violence, but through silence and patience. And though the city's streets would return to their rhythm, the underworld would never quite be the same again. Those who dared to challenge the Gambinos now knew the quiet man watching from the shadows could be the most dangerous enemy of all. Carlo's reputation had spread far beyond the Gambino family, and soon it reached the ears of one of the most powerful men in the city, Don Vito Genovese. The older godfather had seen many men come and go, some rising quickly, only to fall even faster. But something about Carlo caught his eye. It wasn't just the quiet way Carlo moved through the world. It was his ability to make decisions without hesitation, without fear. In a world where the loudest man often demanded attention, Carlo's silence had power. Don Vito recognized that power, even if most others missed it. Their first meeting was unremarkable, a simple dinner in a private room, the kind of gathering that often happened between men who held the reins of New York's underworld. But what was different about Carlo was his lack of ambition. He didn't come to the table with demands, with grand plans to make himself more powerful. He didn't try to impress or ingratiate himself. He simply listened, watched, and responded only when necessary. It wasn't arrogance that kept him quiet. It was understanding. He understood that the most powerful men didn't need to raise their voices. Their decisions were enough to make others listen. Don Vito studied Carlo for a while, observing him from across the room as if sizing him up. He saw in him something that others didn't, a rare calmness, an ability to make the hard decisions, the ones others feared, without breaking a sweat. He admired how Carlo could read a situation in seconds, see the possible outcomes, and choose the right course of action without letting emotion cloud his judgment. For a man like Don Vito, that was invaluable. As the months passed, Carlo began spending more time with Don Vito, learning from him not just about business, but about the delicate art of leadership. Don Vito didn't rule through fear, but through respect. He knew when to act, when to stay still, and when to let things unfold naturally. Carlo absorbed it all, not through words, but through watching the Don's every move. The Don never needed to say much. His presence alone commanded loyalty and fear. Carlo began to understand that true power wasn't about brute force. It was about influence, control, and, most importantly, timing. The old godfather trusted him now. Carlo had become his advisor, his confidant. There were few men in the world who could earn that trust. Don Vito saw in him a kindred spirit, someone who would never let emotions cloud their judgment, someone who understood that the underworld wasn't about winning battles, it was about winning wars. Carlo became more than just a soldier. He was the steady hand that guided the family through turbulent times, always calm, always calculating. And for Carlo, it was the final step in his transformation. He wasn't just a rising star in the Gambino family anymore. He was now part of the greater web that held New York's criminal empire together. The Don's gaze was a heavy one, but Carlo knew now that it was a mark of respect. It wasn't just his ability to eliminate rivals that made him valuable. It was his mind, his ability to navigate the storm without ever letting it rattle him. Don Vito had seen that, and in doing so, he had made Carlo Gambino untouchable. The news came in whispers at first, too soft to be real, but as the hours passed, the truth became clear. A rival family, one that had long looked at the Gambinos with envy, had made a bold move. It wasn't the usual power struggle over territory or business. No, this was personal. Carlo's family, the ones he had spent years protecting, had been targeted. It wasn't just the business anymore. His mother, his brothers, and even his children were now in the crosshairs. This wasn't a statement of dominance. It was an attack, a message meant to tear at his very foundation. Carlo didn't flinch. He never did. He sat in silence, the weight of the news settling on him like a storm cloud, and for the first time in his life, he didn't react, not immediately. He had learned, in his years of service to the family, that rash decisions often led to worse consequences. Anger had no place in this world. Patience did. So he waited. In the weeks that followed, he operated as he always did, in the shadows, moving quietly, almost imperceptibly. He didn't gather his men in anger, didn't start making threats or screaming for vengeance. Instead, he observed. He learned. Every move the rival family made, every whisper he could catch, every slip-up they left in their wake, he filed it away in his mind. It wasn't until the third week that Carlo made his decision. The time for mercy had passed. He had always been the type to see the larger picture, to operate with restraint. But this was different. In his silence, he had come to a conclusion that would change everything. Mercy was a weakness. It was a kindness that could be misunderstood, a vulnerability that could be exploited. In his world, where betrayal was always a breath away, where loyalty was bought with fear as much as it was with respect, there was no room for softness. The very thing that had made him rise so high, his ability to make the hard choices, now demanded he act without hesitation. Carlo didn't need to make an announcement, didn't need to rally his forces with a grand speech. His actions would speak for themselves. In the following days, the rivals began to feel the weight of his wrath. It wasn't chaotic or desperate. It was precise, calculated, surgical. One by one, their operations were undermined, their assets destroyed. He didn't kill in broad daylight. He took his time, made sure everything fell into place like the pieces of a puzzle he had already solved in his mind. The rival family's world began to unravel quietly, slowly, until there was nothing left but silence. For Carlo, it was a lesson in power. Power wasn't in showing mercy. It was in deciding when to be merciless. The moment he made that choice, the foundation he had built his empire on grew stronger. He wasn't just a shadow anymore. He was the storm. And in the underworld, that's the only thing that truly mattered. The assignment came in quietly, like all the others. Carlo had been asked to eliminate a threat, someone who had been making waves, stirring up trouble for the Gambinos. The man in question wasn't just a problem. He was an obstacle to everything Carlo had worked for. For him, the job was simple. Kill him, and remove the threat from the equation. Nothing personal, just business. That's how Carlo saw it, and that's how he would execute it. The target was a high-ranking member of a rival family, someone who had grown too confident in his rise. The kind of man who thought power came with noise, who thought that loud threats and grand gestures were the keys to dominance. Carlo knew better. He understood that silence was the true weapon. In the quiet, there was control, and it was that control that he would wield with deadly precision. He spent days watching. He didn't rush, didn't make any impulsive decisions. He observed the man's habits, his weaknesses, the patterns in his movements. Carlo wasn't in a hurry. The kill would happen when the time was right. He wanted to make it clean, efficient, nothing sloppy, nothing left to chance. The man would never see it coming, and that's exactly how Carlo liked it. On the day of the job, Carlo moved like a shadow. No one saw him coming. No one heard his footsteps. His presence was barely a whisper in the darkened alleyways, and he blended seamlessly into the night. By the time the target stepped out into the street, it was already too late. Carlo was there, just a few feet away, hidden in plain sight. The silence of the moment was suffocating. No threats, no taunts, just the soft, rhythmic click of Carlo's gun as he pulled the trigger. It was over before the target had time to blink. One shot to the back of the head, a final, quiet end. Carlo stood over the body for a moment, letting the weight of the act settle in. It wasn't about triumph or glory. It was just another job completed. Another enemy removed. He left as he always did, without a trace. There was no need for dramatics, no need to bask in the aftermath. Carlo wasn't in the business of flaunting his kills. His reputation was built on something far stronger than the blood he spilled. It was built on his ability to vanish without a trace. By the time anyone even noticed the body, Carlo was already gone, his footsteps long since erased by the city's noise. The job, cold and methodical, was a reminder of Carlo's growing legend. He wasn't just feared for his ruthlessness. He was feared because he was the ghost in the room, the one who could make someone disappear without leaving a mark. And as his influence in the underworld expanded, it became clear that Carlo Gambino wasn't just a man to be feared. He was a man who could erase anyone, anytime, without hesitation, and without ever being seen. Carlo sat quietly in his study, the dim light from the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. He was alone, as always, surrounded by the noise of the world, yet distant from it. His mind drifted back to the days when he first understood what the mafia truly was. Not just a group of men bound by blood, but by a set of unspoken rules. A code, as they called it. It wasn't written down. It wasn't discussed openly, but it was always there, guiding every move they made, every decision, and every action. Loyalty was at the core of it. Loyalty to the family, to the code, to the men who stood beside you. It wasn't about love, not really. It was something deeper. It was about trust. Trust that if you did your job well, your brothers would have your back. Trust that when things went wrong, as they always did, they wouldn't turn on you. It was a bond forged in silence, built on actions far louder than words could ever be. But loyalty, Carlo had learned, was also a double-edged sword. The deeper you were in, the more you gave up. It wasn't just about protecting your own. It was about sacrificing parts of yourself for the family. Sometimes it was about walking away from opportunities that could have made you rich in a way that no one could ever understand. Sometimes it meant killing a man who had once been your friend because he had become a liability. And no matter how much you wanted to turn away, no matter how many times you thought about a different life, you couldn't. Because loyalty wasn't just a rule, it was a chain, and it was wrapped around your soul. But there was another truth Carlo couldn't ignore. The same loyalty that tied you to the family also bound you to a life of sacrifice and compromise. In the mafia, personal gain was something that often had to be buried, sometimes deep. Ambition couldn't shine too brightly, or it would be snuffed out. To rise in the ranks meant to play the game without ever truly playing for yourself. You played for the family, for the code. It wasn't about what you could get out of it. It was about what you were willing to give up. As Carlo stared at the faded photo on his desk, a reminder of a time before everything became complicated, he wondered if the world outside the family ever truly understood that. Could they? Could anyone who wasn't in this world understand the weight of loyalty, the sacrifices, and the quiet battles fought behind closed doors? his thoughts lingered on the faces of those who had come before him, the men who had taught him that actions spoke louder than words, that silence was the strongest weapon, and that the Mafia's code was not just a set of rules, but a life to be lived. A life where loyalty and sacrifice were everything, but where the price was always higher than anyone could imagine. In the world of the Mafia, there were no simple answers, no easy choices. And as Carlo leaned back in his chair, he realized the truth of the code he had long ago accepted. To survive in this world, you had to be willing to pay a price far steeper than anyone else could understand. Carlo had always believed that loyalty was the cornerstone of his world. It was the thread that bound everything together, the quiet understanding that you stood by your brothers no matter what, that the family came first. He had lived by that code, adhered to it with a faith that had made him an unshakable presence in the Gambino family. But one evening, a betrayal shattered that foundation, leaving him to grapple with a truth that he had long avoided. The news came to him in whispers, soft enough to be dismissed, yet sharp enough to cut through the calm he had cultivated over the years. A trusted associate, a man he had once called a friend, had turned on him. The details didn't matter. The act itself was what stung. The betrayal wasn't some isolated incident, but a deliberate effort to undermine Carlo's authority, to chip away at the power he had worked tirelessly to build. At first, Carlo tried to reason with himself, to believe that there was a misunderstanding, but deep down, he knew. The weight of it hung in the air, a quiet tension that he couldn't shake. He was being tested not by the outside world, but by those closest to him. He had always prided himself on keeping his enemies in plain sight, on knowing where everyone stood. But this was different. This was someone who had been allowed too close, someone whose ambition had clouded their loyalty. In the stillness of his office, Carlo stared at the darkened window, the city lights casting long shadows on the walls. He didn't need to hear more. He knew what had to be done. The man's fate had already been sealed the moment he chose to betray Carlo. In the world Carlo inhabited, there was no room for weakness, no room for hesitation. The next move was simple. The man was no longer valuable to the family. His existence had become a liability. He had to be removed quietly, decisively, without fanfare. Carlo had learned over the years that the most dangerous enemies were the ones who wore the same face as your ally. And the most dangerous thing you could do was let them linger, let them plot from the shadows. He had seen it happen before. One moment of weakness, one slip, and everything could unravel. When the deed was done, Carlo felt no satisfaction, no relief. It was the price of business, nothing more. The ruthless side of him, the part he had kept buried under layers of control, began to emerge more prominently. He understood, perhaps for the first time, the weight of his position. He was not just a member of the family anymore. He was its protector, its judge, and its executioner. The streets of New York would remain the same, indifferent to the violence that had just been carried out in their midst. But Carlo knew better. He had taken another step into the darkness, and there would be no turning back. The man had been eliminated, but the cost of loyalty was becoming clearer with each passing day. Carlo sat alone in the corner of a small, dimly lit room, the silence stretching around him like a heavy blanket. The world outside moved on, cars honked, voices shouted, the city pulsed with its ceaseless energy. But here, in his quiet corner, everything seemed still. It was a rare moment, one he had carved out for himself after years of constant motion, of always being one step ahead of the storm. But even in this brief lull, the weight of his decisions hung over him, pressing down harder than the old leather chair he sank into. He had always thrived in the chaos of the underworld, finding comfort in its constant unpredictability. But now, in the quiet, the emptiness echoed louder. The faces of men he had silenced, the lives he had ended, all flashed behind his eyes in fleeting, jagged images. He hadn't meant for it to feel this way. He had never stopped to consider the toll it would take. But now, with a rare moment of stillness, the impact of his actions came rushing in. Carlo didn't regret the choices he had made. He had always known what the price was, had accepted it without hesitation. But as he sat there, away from the shadows and the whispers, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling deep in his gut. The constant need to prove his loyalty, to safeguard the family, had become a burden he had not anticipated. His hands were stained with blood, and while his mind had always justified it, each action had a reason, each death a necessity. His heart couldn't deny the void that now stretched before him. He thought about the life he could have had, the life that slipped away the moment he stepped into this world. A life without surveillance, without constant fear of betrayal, without the ever-present weight of decisions made in darkness. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew that life was gone. It had been replaced by something else entirely, an existence where he was defined by the quiet, unspoken power that flowed through the shadows. The storm would come again, he knew it. That's how it worked. It always did. But for now, in this quiet moment, Carlo allowed himself to be human. He allowed himself the luxury of stillness, of reflection, of being something other than the man who orchestrated death with a calm hand. His mind wandered to memories of childhood, to the days when innocence had been an option. Before the family, before the power, before the blood. It felt like another lifetime. But the peace was fleeting, as it always was. The knock at the door was soft, almost tentative, but Carlo heard it clearly. The storm was coming, and it was time for him to step back into the world he had created. With a steady hand, he pushed himself out of the chair, straightened his shirt, and walked to the door. It was time. The call to power had never been a loud one. Carlo knew that. The streets had never been kind to those who made a spectacle of themselves, and the mafia, in its quiet brutality, operated on a different set of rules. It wasn't the loudest man in the room who took control. It was the one who understood the value of silence. Carlo understood that well. The cracks within the Gambino family had begun to show, slowly at first, like a faint tremor before the earthquake. Old allegiances were being tested, and loyalty, once a firm foundation, was starting to erode. The older men, the ones who had held the reins for so long, were growing weak, their vision clouded by time. In their absence, new opportunities emerged, opportunities that Carlo would seize with the same calm precision that had guided him thus far. He watched, listened, and when the time was right, he acted. His rise was not the result of grand gestures, but of small, deliberate moves. Carlo's strength had always been in his ability to wait, to know when to hold back and when to push forward. Deals were struck behind closed doors, whispers passed in the dark corners of smoky rooms. His influence spread quietly, like water seeping into the cracks of a foundation, unnoticed until it was too late. Carlo made allies when others were too quick to make enemies. He understood that trust was earned slowly, and that loyalty, once bought, could be the most powerful currency in the world. Men who had once thought little of him now found themselves indebted to him, their lives forever entwined with his. He used that trust as leverage, slowly building his position, until those who had once ruled beside him now found themselves looking to him for guidance. It wasn't long before the whispers began to spread, a new name on the lips of those who ran the streets: Carlo Gambino. It was inevitable, really. The system, the family, it all had a rhythm, and Carlo had learned to dance to its beat better than anyone else. In the shadows, his power had solidified. His every move was calculated, every step a building block for his ascent. He was patient, but he wasn't waiting anymore. He was positioning himself for the moment when he would step into the light. The change of leadership was subtle, but it was unmistakable. The men who had once made the decisions were now passing the torch, whether willingly or not. Carlo had become the face of the new era, a quiet force who commanded respect with nothing more than his presence. He had taken the reins, not through force, but through a series of well-placed moves, each one leading him closer to the top. And when the old guard finally stepped aside, it was Carlo who stood alone, at the helm of the Gambino family. The transition was seamless, almost imperceptible, but it marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. Carlo had risen not with noise, but with silence. And now, with the power in his hands, he would show them what a quiet man could truly accomplish. Carlo's ascension to dawn was as silent as it had been inevitable. The day came without fanfare, without the bloodshed that many expected. The family had always known who held the power, but now it was official. Carlo Gambino stood at the top, not with the bravado of a king, but with the quiet authority of a man who had learned the art of control from the shadows. The old ways, the loud threats, the displays of power, the drama of the streets were no longer necessary. The world was changing, and Carlo understood that better than anyone. His approach had always been different, quieter. He knew that a ruler who made noise would only invite chaos, but a ruler who moved in silence, he commanded respect without ever needing to say a word. Under his reign, the Gambino family would no longer operate like the bombastic forces of old. Carlo cast aside the brashness of the past and steered the family into a new era, one that was more strategic, more calculated. Every move was measured, every decision carefully considered. Carlo trusted in his ability to influence through subtlety rather than aggression. He built alliances not through intimidation, but through trust, always knowing when to hold his cards close and when to reveal just enough to keep his adversaries off balance. His presence was felt, but it was rarely seen. Carlo moved like a shadow through the empire he had inherited. He rarely attended meetings, preferring to send others in his stead. But when he did speak, his words carried weight. And when he gave orders, they were followed without question. The power of his silence was his greatest weapon. He controlled the streets without ever needing to walk them. The family, once known for their volatile outbursts, now ran like a well-oiled machine. Carlo's decisions were final, but they were made with a calm that instilled confidence in his men. He didn't need to show strength through violence. He showed it through patience, through meticulous planning, and, most importantly, through the unyielding certainty that his power was absolute. The Quiet Dawn was a new type of ruler for the mafia world. His leadership wasn't defined by the chaos he caused, but by the peace he brought in the silence of his command. Under his watch, the Gambino family flourished. There were no more public spectacles, no more grand confrontations. Instead, there was a methodical rise to the top, a slow, steady dominance that was felt in every corner of the city. Carlo Gambino, the silent ruler, had arrived. His reign was one of stillness, but the empire he commanded moved with a force that could not be ignored. He had embraced the role of the invisible king, never seen, but always there, his power unspoken, yet undeniable. And in the quiet that surrounded him, the mafia world would learn to fear the silence more than the noise. Carlo Gambino's influence stretched like a web, invisible but inescapable. From his quiet corner, he meticulously crafted a master plan that would expand his family's reach across the city. Where others saw risk, Carlo saw opportunity, and he knew that the key to domination wasn't through loud displays of power, but through subtle manipulation and calculated moves. Every alliance he formed was done in silence, a whispered deal in the back room, a nod to someone on the street. No one saw it coming, and no one needed to. The city was a network of connections, and Carlo understood better than anyone how to exploit its veins. He didn't force his way in, didn't make a spectacle of his ambitions. Instead, he moved quietly, weaving himself into the fabric of the city until every corner, every business, every neighborhood, every pocket of influence had been touched by his unseen hand. People knew not to question him, not because they feared him directly, but because they understood that he was always a step ahead, always working in the shadows to ensure his power grew. Carlo knew the importance of control, and he exercised it through patience. There were no sudden moves, no desperate grabs for territory. He carefully observed, learned who held sway in each part of the city, and then he began to move. His influence crept into every boardroom, every street corner, every whispered conversation. When others spoke of expansion, they talked about blood, about violence, about taking what was theirs. Carlo spoke in quieter terms. His strategy was simple. He would buy what he needed, plant his people where they were most effective, and remove the threats before they even had a chance to grow. In his mind, this wasn't just about power, it was about control. And control, he knew, came not through showmanship, but through invisibility. He was everywhere, but he was nowhere. While others made their names in gunfights and confrontations, Carlo made his through quiet whispers, through the slow creep of his influence, until one day the city realized that it was his. As the empire grew, Carlo watched from the shadows, calculating every step with precision. He never rushed. He understood that true power wasn't about forcing others into submission. It was about making them submit without ever realizing they had been. His empire expanded seamlessly, unnoticed by those who might have resisted it if they'd only known what was happening. Carlo had become the unseen hand behind the city's pulse. His family was now at the heart of the business, controlling the most important sectors without anyone knowing it was them. He didn't need accolades or public acknowledgement. He needed only the quiet satisfaction of knowing that, without anyone ever saying a word, the city was his. Carlo Gambino moved through the world like a shadow, a presence felt but never fully seen. His mind was a labyrinth, calculated and precise, built on years of observation and control. In the silence of his thoughts, he justified every action, every decision, even the most brutal ones. To him, violence wasn't a thrill or a rash decision. It was a necessary tool, a means to an end. He had learned long ago that power was not earned through kindness or diplomacy. Power was earned through fear, and fear had its own currency. The people Carlo eliminated were not enemies in his eyes. They were simply obstacles, inconveniences that had to be cleared away for the greater good. His decisions were cold, logical, and devoid of emotion. He had no room for weakness, either in others or in himself. The life he led was one that demanded a constant, unyielding control over every situation, every interaction. He understood that to rule, one had to be willing to do whatever was necessary, no matter how ugly it might seem to those looking from the outside. The idea of death didn't bother Carlo. He had seen it, felt it, and yet it had never truly touched him. Death was a simple end, a transition that left no trace, no mark. In his world, death was part of the game. People died every day, some by his hand, others by the hand of those he controlled. But to Carlo, it was just another consequence, another piece of the puzzle that had to be arranged. He could walk away from a hit without flinching, without feeling a pang of regret. His ability to remain detached was what set him apart, what made him both respected and feared. He didn't see people as individuals with stories and lives. He saw them as players in a game that had no room for hesitation. He lived with a singular focus: control. Every action he took, every move he made, was designed to reinforce that control. Whether it was dealing with rivals or guiding his family's expansion, Carlo's world revolved around maintaining power without ever losing sight of it. He had no illusions about what he had become: a killer, a ruler, a man who had sacrificed everything for the illusion of dominance. But he accepted it. In his mind, the price was worth the cost. He didn't need redemption, didn't need forgiveness. He was a man of the shadows, and that was where he would stay. Carlo never showed his true face to anyone, not his allies, not his enemies, and certainly not to himself. He was a mask, a reflection of what the world needed him to be. The mind of a killer, silent, efficient, and unyielding. To him, life was a series of decisions, each one a stepping stone to greater power, and in the end, when he looked back at what he had built, he would find that control was the only thing worth remembering. Carlo Gambino's power grew not through force, but through whispers. The art of controlling a city was not found in loud declarations or brazen acts of violence. It was found in the quiet words exchanged in the shadows, the subtle manipulation of those too afraid to speak out against him. He had learned early that fear did not need to be visible to be powerful. It just needed to exist, silently, lingering in every corner, in every conversation, in every movement. In the dimly lit back rooms of businesses, in the quiet offices of corrupt officials, Carlo's name became a legend. People spoke of him, not with hatred or anger, but with the quiet reverence reserved for someone who was never truly seen, but always felt. When Carlo wanted something, it was never demanded outright. No, he used the whisper's small, insistent words planted in the right ears. A suggestion here, a subtle reminder there, and soon the city was moving in the direction he desired, often without even realizing it. Rival families began to crumble under the weight of their own paranoia. They had their spies, their informants, but none of them could match the quiet efficiency of Carlo's influence. His network of loyal men, who never spoke too loudly, had infiltrated every corner of the city, and through these men, Carlo made sure that every action, every move, was dictated by his will. It was never about open confrontation, it was about control, about making sure no one ever questioned his dominance. As the families around him fractured and fell, Carlo's position grew more secure. He was no longer just a player in the game. He had become the game itself. Those who sought his favor did so in hushed tones, careful to avoid even the slightest hint of disrespect. Those who tried to challenge him found their plans crumbling before they could even begin. A whisper in the right ear, a nod of agreement from the right person, and suddenly, the rival family would find itself betrayed, its alliances shattered by unseen forces. Carlo wasn't just a man anymore. He had become an idea. He was the looming shadow in the back of every mind, the quiet terror that lingered just beyond the edge of vision. He had never needed to make a spectacle of himself. His power was built on the subtle art of fear, on the knowledge that no matter how safe someone felt, they would never truly be free of his influence. Carlo Gambino had become both a figure of respect and a symbol of terror. And in that duality, he had found his greatest strength. As the years passed, Carlo Gambino's empire flourished, yet his silence began to take its toll. He had mastered the art of being unseen, of becoming a shadow in the world he controlled. But now that shadow felt heavier than it ever had before. The power that he had once embraced, the ability to move unnoticed through the streets, now felt like a shackle, chaining him to a world of isolation. There were moments when he would stand in the grand solitude of his office, watching his empire thrive from behind the scenes, surrounded by wealth and loyalty. But the silence was deafening. His men obeyed him without question, but no one ever truly spoke to him. They feared him too much, respected him too deeply, and above all, they knew their place in the world he controlled. They were cogs in the machine, doing their part without ever seeking his company, his friendship, or even a conversation beyond what was necessary. Carlo had created this distance himself, but now, in the quiet moments, the consequences of that distance began to gnaw at him. He had built his empire on a foundation of silence and fear, but there were days when the weight of his decisions pressed down on him, when the cold, empty spaces in his world felt suffocating. It wasn't the power that troubled him, it was the emptiness that followed. No one could understand what it was like to be the figurehead of an empire as vast as his. a man who commanded everything and everyone but had no one to turn to, no one to speak the words that went unspoken in his mind. His thoughts turned inward, and in those rare moments when he allowed himself to look beyond the empire, he found only loneliness. He had built this life with one goal in mind: to be untouchable, to be the master of every move. But in doing so, he had created a prison of his own making. He could not remember the last time he had spoken to a friend, not a business partner or subordinate, but a true confidant. Even his family, the ones closest to him, had become figures he only saw when necessary, and the distance had grown between them too. The silence that once had given him strength now began to feel like a weight on his chest, suffocating him with every passing day. His men whispered about his genius, his ability to remain untouchable, but no one saw the cost of that power. They did not see the man who had spent so many years alone, a king with no throne, a ruler with no voice beyond orders. In the world he had built, silence was his weapon, but now, in the dark corners of his mind, it was a price he no longer wished to pay. Carlo had always believed that loyalty was the bedrock of his empire. He had carefully surrounded himself with men who trusted him, and in turn, he trusted them. They knew their place, they understood the rules, and they never questioned his authority. But as with all things built on fear, the foundation was never as strong as it appeared. It started quietly, a whisper in the shadows. A trusted ally, a man Carlo had known for years, had begun to act differently. The first signs were subtle: a few missed meetings, a lack of communication when Carlo needed it most, an unsettling coldness in his eyes when their paths crossed. Carlo, ever vigilant, noticed the shifts, but he gave no outward sign of concern. He had learned long ago that suspicion, if expressed too loudly, was the very thing that invited betrayal. But when the news came, when the facts were laid bare before him, he was forced to confront it. His ally had turned. The betrayal wasn't just a slight, it was a full-blown conspiracy. Carlo's empire was under threat, and it was coming from someone within his own ranks. The traitor had struck deals with rival families, trading information that could unravel everything he had worked for. The foundations of his silent empire trembled. Carlo's reaction was swift, as it always was. He did not scream, did not lash out in anger. That was never his way. Instead, he let the silence hang for a moment, allowing the weight of the situation to settle over him. Then, with the same quiet precision that had made him a legend, he moved. The whispers began quiet at first, then louder, until the message spread like wildfire. He used the very tool his enemies feared, the ability to control the flow of information. He turned the traitor's allies against him with careful leaks, subtle moves, and promises made to those who stood to gain from his fall. By the time the traitor understood what was happening, it was too late. His world, built on lies, crumbled as quickly as it had been constructed. The allies he thought would protect him turned their backs, realizing that in the world of the mafia, nothing was more dangerous than betraying the one who controlled the silence. Carlo had no need to raise a hand. The traitor had already been undone by the very people he had counted on. The whispers that had started as a whisper of a threat turned into a full-blown storm. As for Carlo, he stood still in the eye of it all. The empire remained intact, but the cracks were beginning to show. For the first time, his empire of silence had been pierced. He had dealt with the betrayal, but the damage was done. The world around him would never be as quiet again. For the first time in years, Carlo could feel the pressure building around him, squeezing from all sides. The empire he had so carefully constructed, the silent, invisible reign that had made him the most feared and respected figure in the city, was starting to falter. The cracks that had once seemed so distant, mere imperfections on the edge of his world, now widened into chasms. Rival families, emboldened by his earlier betrayals and his increasing isolation, began to push back. The streets, once his to command through whispers and calculated moves, grew louder with opposition. It wasn't just the families who were challenging him anymore, but the very fabric of his empire, the men who once served him, now beginning to question his authority. They whispered of weakness, of a time when Carlo's grip was not as firm, when his silence seemed less like power and more like fear. They could smell it, the scent of vulnerability, and like wolves sensing weakness, they circled. Carlo remained in the shadows, as he always had, but the darkness felt different now. It wasn't the comforting cloak of control he had once known. It was suffocating, as if the very air had turned stale. His mind, once sharp and calculating, began to cloud with thoughts of what he had never allowed himself to consider before: his own downfall. He'd always believed that silence was the key to dominance, that by staying unseen, remaining in the background, he could pull the strings without anyone ever noticing. But now, as his enemies grew bolder and his allies more distant, Carlo could feel the weight of his silence pressing against him. He had built his empire on the backs of whispers and shadowy deals, but there were fewer whispers now, and the shadows no longer offered protection. The mafia landscape was changing. The old rules, the ones Carlo had so masterfully manipulated, no longer applied. Younger, more ruthless men were rising through the ranks. Men who didn't understand the art of silence, men who thrived on chaos. They fought in the open, declared their wars loud and clear, and their success made Carlo's quiet approach seem like a relic of the past. Sitting in his study, alone once again, Carlo contemplated the inevitable. The empire he had spent a lifetime building was slipping away, piece by piece, and he couldn't stop it. He had always prided himself on never needing to fight for control. He had always held power through influence, through understanding of those around him. But now, that influence was crumbling, and there was nothing left but the silence that had once been his weapon. He knew that the end was near. He had always been prepared for it, always ready to fade into the shadows when the time came. But this felt different. This wasn't a graceful exit. It was the slow unraveling of everything he had ever known. As he sat in the dark, Carlo prepared for the worst, knowing that even the greatest empires could fall without a sound. The silence that had once defined Carlo's power now felt like a suffocating weight. His enemies, sensing his growing vulnerability, had begun to stir in the shadows. It started with whispers. Small rumors passed from one ear to another until the words found their mark. Rival families, long kept at bay by Carlo's quiet yet ironclad rule, began to stir, slowly coiling into a dangerous alliance. They saw the cracks, felt the tremors of his weakening influence, and moved to strike. Carlo watched, as he always had, with a calm that bordered on indifference. He allowed them the first move. It was a calculated choice, one rooted in the deep understanding that the first mistake always belonged to those who acted too quickly, too recklessly. He would let them make their move, let them reveal their hand before he responded. In the world Carlo had built, patience was not just a virtue, it was the foundation of his survival. The families, now unified under a shared hunger for power, began to make their subtle moves. There were no open assaults, no loud declarations of war. Those would have been too foolish, too revealing. Instead, they struck in ways Carlo could not immediately retaliate against. They used influence, planted seeds of doubt, turned men who had once sworn loyalty to him into nothing more than pawns in a larger game. Their war was a silent one, fought not with bullets, but with whispers, with careful, calculated moves that would unravel him piece by piece. But Carlo was no fool. The game, though quiet, was still a battle, and Carlo was an expert in maneuvering in the dark. He knew the importance of not showing his hand too early. As the rival families aligned against him, he remained the calm in the center of the storm, studying their moves from the shadows. He knew the rules. They had all been his rules once, and now they would turn against him. He had been a master at this game, and now he would watch as it was played against him. In the depths of the night, when even the city seemed to hold its breath, Carlo's mind worked tirelessly. He knew that his enemies thought they had found their opening, that they believed they had cornered him, but they were wrong. They had underestimated the power of silence. They had underestimated Carlo Gambino. He didn't need to act now. He didn't need to make a move. Not yet. The first battle was always about knowing when to let your enemies play their hand, and for now, he would remain in the shadows, a ghost in their midst, watching, listening, waiting. The war had begun, but it was still his to win. It always had been. The air felt thick with tension as Carlo sat alone in his office, the quiet of the room pressing in on him like the weight of a storm gathering on the horizon. For years, he had built his empire with nothing more than whispers and careful silences, and for a time, it had been enough to keep his enemies at bay. But the past, like a ghost, had a way of returning when least expected, and tonight it came knocking. The door to his office creaked open, and a figure stepped into the dim light. Carlo didn't need to look up to know who it was. The voice that followed, the familiar cadence of a long-forgotten enemy, sent a chill down his spine. It was a name he had hoped to bury with time, a ghost from his earlier days that had long since faded into the shadows. But now, like all things in the mafia, it was back. "You thought you'd buried me, didn't you?" The voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that made the room feel smaller. "You thought you could erase me from your past." Carlo's eyes remained fixed on the desk in front of him, his hands folded neatly in his lap. He didn't need to acknowledge the man standing before him. He had learned long ago that sometimes the silence spoke louder than words, but the ghost from his past wasn't waiting for an invitation. "I've watched you, Carlo," the man continued, stepping closer, the sound of his shoes echoing in the otherwise still room. "You've built an empire, yes, but the cost of your silence, of your careful control, it's catching up with you now. You think you've won, but you've forgotten the price of power." Carlo's gaze finally lifted, meeting the man's eyes for the first time in years. There was no fear in his stare, only calculation. This was no longer about power. It was about something deeper. Respect, loyalty, things that couldn't be bought, but could be shattered by a single betrayal. The game had changed, and it was no longer about who had the most men, but who had the most influence in the shadows. The man was no longer the threat he once was, but his return was a reminder of how quickly things could unravel. Carlo knew that to ignore him would be a mistake, but to show weakness would be even worse. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate. "You've always been a ghost," Carlo said, his voice calm but cutting through the silence like a knife. "And ghosts don't scare me." There was no immediate response. The man seemed to weigh Carlo's words, the years of animosity hanging in the air like smoke. In that moment, the quiet death of a once promising rivalry loomed between them. Neither would make the first move. This was a battle of wits, not violence. Silence had always been Carlo's weapon of choice, and it would be again. "Leave," Carlo finally said, his words soft, but final. The ghost turned, disappearing back into the shadows, his presence fading as quickly as it had arrived. But the weight of what had just transpired remained. The battle of silence, of control, would continue, but for now, Carlo had won. The weight of power had always been Carlo's companion, but now it felt like a crushing burden, pulling him under with each passing day. The empire he had built from the ground up, one whisper at a time, was beginning to crack. Once, the very name Gambino had commanded fear, respect, and loyalty. Now, it seemed to be slipping through his fingers, no matter how tightly he gripped it. Every corner of his world, every safe house, every ally was filled with uncertainty. His enemies, once lurking in the shadows, now moved with purpose. The streets of New York, once his domain, were no longer under his control. The whispers were growing louder, carrying tales of betrayal, of cracks in the walls of his empire. Families that once feared him now plotted against him, and the allies who had sworn loyalty had turned their backs. Carlo, the man who had mastered silence, now found himself surrounded by noise, the chaos of things he could no longer control. In the quiet moments, when the weight of it all became too much, Carlo found himself retreating further into his thoughts. What had he really built, and at what cost? His family, once a source of strength, was now fractured, each member drawn into the same dangerous game that had claimed so many others. He had made sacrifices, ones he had justified as necessary, but now, the toll of those sacrifices was undeniable. His control, which had once seemed invincible, was slipping away, and with it, the legacy he had worked so hard to create. He thought of the men who had once followed him, the ones he had trusted, the ones who had sworn loyalty in the quietest of voices. But loyalty, he realized, was a fragile thing. It could be bought, but never fully guaranteed. He had always known that he had always accepted it as part of the game. But now, with his back against the wall, the truth of it hit him harder than ever. The room was empty, save for the faint hum of the city outside, and yet it felt suffocating. Carlo sat alone, his fingers tracing the rim of a glass in front of him. He had spent his entire life building an empire that he had thought would outlast him. But now, as the cracks deepened and the whispers turned into roars, he was forced to ask himself, what was the price of control? What had he truly gained, and what had he lost? He had never allowed himself the luxury of doubt, but now, with everything crumbling around him, he could feel it gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. His legacy, once so certain, now seemed fragile, almost fleeting. And for the first time in years, Carlo felt vulnerable. The silence that had once been his greatest weapon now felt empty, like the stillness before a storm. His empire was crumbling, but it was more than just power slipping away. It was the realization that he might have sacrificed everything for something that could never truly be his, and that thought, more than anything, terrified him. The walls were closing in, tighter than ever before. Carlo Gambino, the whispering assassin, a man whose name had once been spoken in fear and reverence, now found himself a hunted man. The government's pursuit was relentless. Every move he made, every shadow he hid in, seemed to bring the world crashing down on him. The quiet life he had so meticulously crafted was now a broken illusion. His enemies, those within his own ranks and the forces outside, were converging, and the quiet that had once defined his reign had turned into a deafening silence. His enemies knew it, and so did he. The clock was ticking, the final moments of his empire slipping away with every passing second. The rival families had moved with calculated precision, their alliance a force to be reckoned with. But it was not just the families that threatened his power. The government had finally caught up to him. Every wiretap, every informant, every movement was now under constant surveillance. Carlo could feel it. His time was running out. But even in the face of this, he remained the same, calculating, cold, silent. His mind, sharper than ever, mapped out his every option. Escape, negotiation, confrontation, each was weighed with the precision of a man who had lived his life in the shadows. But for the first time in years, Carlo found himself uncertain. The weight of his decisions, the ghosts of his past, the lives he had taken and betrayed, now stood before him. There was no way out this time. No whispers in the dark to guide him. It was all coming to an end. The final showdown came with the force of inevitability. There was no room for hesitation, no more games to play. The family, the empire he had built, had been fractured by betrayal, and Carlo, despite his mastery of silence, was no longer the figure in control. A trusted ally had turned against him, and the government was closing in on his last few safe houses. His empire had become a trap. He sat in the dark room, the weight of the world pressing on him. The final call had been made, there was no turning back. His enemies were at the gates, and this time, Carlo knew that silence would not save him. He could feel the approach of his death, like a shadow creeping closer with every breath he took. In his final moments, there were no regrets, no last words. There was only the knowledge that the game, the empire, had come to its end. As the door to his hideout opened and the first footsteps echoed through the hall, Carlo Gambino, the whispering assassin, knew this was it. The reign of the man who had once controlled the streets with nothing but silence and fear was over. The assassin who had moved through the shadows, unseen and untouchable, had finally been found. In the silence of his last breath, Carlo Gambino's legacy was sealed, not in the power he had once held, but in the emptiness left behind. Carlo Gambino sat in the dimly lit room, the faint hum of the city just beyond his window. His empire, once a force that had spread across the streets like an unspoken legend, was now crumbling. The walls were closing in, not just from his enemies but from time itself. Every move, every decision in these final hours was weighted with the responsibility of his family's survival. The Gambinos, his bloodline, his legacy, it all depended on the final plan. For years, Carlo had moved with silence, with precision. He was the master of shadows, the whispering assassin whose name had once been enough to freeze the blood of anyone who dared oppose him. But now, it was different. His name meant nothing to those in power. His enemies had seen to that. And so, in the final moments, Carlo found himself willing to sacrifice it all. The plan was simple, almost too simple, yet it was the only way. Carlo would fade from the public eye. He would disappear from the world he had shaped, allowing his family to survive. The streets would no longer remember his name. There would be no final stand, no grandiose moment of glory. His family needed to move forward, free from the looming shadow of his fall. But that freedom came at a cost: his own life. He made the call, one last time, to the few men still loyal to him. It was a whisper, a quiet agreement, a promise of protection for the family. He had worked it out, orchestrated every detail, every step of this final act, and now there would be no turning back. The pieces were already in motion, and Carlo knew there was no escape for him. But that didn't matter. His death, though inevitable, was part of the plan. The Gambinos would live on. They would grow in power, even in his absence. As Carlo prepared to leave, to take his final steps into the night, there was no fear, just a quiet resolve. His legacy would not die with him. It would continue, woven into the fabric of the city. His sacrifice would ensure that the Gambino family would rise again, that they would survive beyond the betrayals, beyond the battles. The last moments were fleeting. He walked through the door and into the shadows, just as he had always done. But this time, there would be no return. The whispering assassin would disappear into the night, leaving behind a legend, a void, and a family with a future carved in silence. The streets of New York were quieter now. The chaos that had once vibrated with the pulse of the Gambino family's rule had dissipated into a heavy silence, one that felt unnatural after so many years of dominance. Carlo Gambino was gone, and with him, the calm, controlled power that had held the city in a chokehold. His empire, once a testament to meticulous planning and ruthless ambition, began to unravel, its threads slipping away as new leaders, hungry for control, rose to fill the void he left behind. There was no grand ceremony for Carlo's fall, no final battle. He had disappeared into the shadows as quietly as he had lived, leaving behind an empire that had been built on fear, respect, and the knowledge that silence was often more deadly than a gunshot. But in the aftermath, that silence began to speak louder than any gunfight or street battle ever could. His absence was deafening. The new leaders, some from within, others from rival families, began to pick up the pieces of the empire Carlo had left behind. The streets, once under his rule, were now ruled by men who hadn't learned the art of whispers. They were brash, loud, eager to stake their claims in ways Carlo never would have. They fought openly for control, with violence spilling onto the streets once again, filling the air with the sounds of gunshots and shouts. But no matter how they tried to remake the empire, they could never escape the shadow Carlo had cast. The city, the men who worked for him, the very underworld of New York, had been shaped by him in ways no one could replicate. His calm, his ability to stay in the background, to move like a ghost through the underworld, these were qualities that couldn't be faked. His legacy wasn't just in the businesses he controlled or the men he had killed. It was in the way he had made himself a part of the city's very fabric, in the way fear and loyalty had been woven together to form the backbone of his reign. As the new leaders stepped into the chaos, they found that power, especially the kind Carlo had wielded, came at a cost. The empire he had built was crumbling, not because of external threats, but because of the internal fractures that had always existed beneath the surface. Greed, ambition, and the constant struggle for control had driven Carlo's empire to the edge, and in his absence, those fractures deepened. The shadow of Carlo Gambino lingered long after his fall. His name was still spoken in hushed tones, his methods analyzed and imitated by men who could never hope to replicate his quiet mastery. The empire he had built on fear and respect may have crumbled, but his legacy, like the whispering wind, remained a force in the city, an unspoken reminder of what it had once been and what it had lost. The absence of Carlo Gambino left a hollow space in the heart of the family, a void that no one seemed capable of filling. The empire he had meticulously crafted, a web of alliances and fear, began to fray at the edges. Without Carlo's calculating presence, the Gambino family teetered on the brink of collapse. The men who had once operated under the quiet weight of his authority now found themselves scrambling for control, each of them thinking they could do it better, each of them believing they were the true heir to his empire. The family was no longer united by the bond of loyalty, but by the fractures that began to show with Carlo's absence. What had once been an ironclad network of whispers and gestures had become a battlefield, where trust was a rare commodity and betrayal a constant threat. There were murmurs in the dark corners of the streets, whispers of power plays, of loyalty traded for a taste of control. Old allies turned on each other, and those who had once stood by Carlo's side now fought over scraps, desperately trying to carve out their own piece of what was left. For the younger generation, the fall of their patriarch was more than just the loss of a leader. It was the unraveling of their entire world. They had been raised in the shadow of Carlo's power, taught the ways of silence and control, but the lessons had been incomplete. They had watched as their fathers and uncles waged wars behind closed doors, but they had never truly understood the cost of that power until it was gone. Now, they found themselves unprepared for the chaos that followed, thrown into a world where loyalty was a currency that no one seemed willing to pay. The family's name, once a symbol of quiet strength, was now a target. Rival families, sensing weakness, circled like vultures, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The Gambinos had always been feared for their ability to move in silence, but without Carlo at the helm, the family was no longer the shadow in the corner of the room. It was the center of attention, and not in the way it wanted to be. The younger generation, caught between the legacy of their father and the harsh reality of their new position, began to make reckless decisions. Some sought to prove themselves by taking matters into their own hands. Others tried to rebuild the old alliances, but none of them understood the subtlety that had made Carlo so powerful. They were loud, brash, and eager to establish their dominance. But they lacked the one thing that had made Carlo's reign so effective: patience. As the family tore itself apart, the consequences of Carlo's choices became painfully clear. He had built an empire with careful precision, but he had also left behind a legacy that was fragile, one that depended on his steady hand to keep it intact. Now, his family, fragmented and divided, struggled to hold on to what was left. The lessons of silence, loyalty, and control that had once guided them were now lost in the noise of their desperation. And the name Gambino, once whispered in awe, now carried with it the weight of a dynasty in shambles. Carlo's children grew up in the shadow of an empire that demanded both reverence and fear. Yet when his reign ended, they were left to face the remnants of what he had built. Raised on silence, taught to observe the world with a detached eye, they were never allowed the luxury of innocence. Their lives were steeped in whispers, in half-truths, and the weight of a last name that carried a burden no child should have to bear. Even as they tried to escape the grasp of their father's legacy, it was always there, lurking beneath the surface of their every move. They had watched their father, the silent assassin, as he moved through the world with an effortless command that left no room for doubt or weakness. But now, in his absence, they were faced with the reality of a fractured world. No one would tell them what to do, but they could never escape the expectations that had been ingrained in them from birth. Carlo had been a man of few words, but his legacy was one of absolute control, and his children were expected to carry that weight, whether they wanted to or not. They tried to live normal lives. The world outside the family's influence was a foreign, unfamiliar place, one filled with its own set of rules and challenges. They sought out education, jobs, relationships that weren't tainted by the stains of their past, but the ghosts of their father's actions followed them, silently suffocating the possibility of a peaceful life. Every step they took in the world outside felt like a misstep, a reminder of who they were and the blood that flowed through their veins. In their quiet moments, when the world around them was still, the rebellion began to take root. It wasn't loud or overt, but it was there, like a spark beneath the surface. The children of Carlo Gambino could never completely sever the ties to their father's empire, but they could distance themselves from it, build lives that defied the very nature of the world they had been born into. They rejected the expectations that came with the Gambino name, the whispers that followed them wherever they went, the loyalty to a family that no longer seemed worth the price it had once commanded. The rebellion was quiet, almost imperceptible. They didn't speak out against their father's legacy, but they quietly broke away from the life that had been forced upon them. They chose paths that led them far from the world of power and violence. Yet, even in their rejection of the past, they could never escape it completely. The shadow of their father loomed large, and no matter how much they tried to live normal lives, the weight of the Gambino name remained, a constant reminder that even the children of the silent assassin could never truly be free. The city had always been a battlefield, but in the wake of Carlo's fall, it became a war zone. The once steady pulse of the Gambino family, like a silent drumbeat beneath the surface of New York, was replaced by a cacophony of rival factions scrambling to fill the void. Each new mafia, hungry for power, began to rise from the ashes of Carlo's empire. Some were old foes, eager to take what had once been theirs. Others were new, driven by ambition and bloodlust, hoping to carve their names into the city's grim history. The underworld was in chaos, a fracturing web of allegiances, betrayals, and shifting loyalties. No longer were the streets dominated by the quiet power that Carlo had wielded, the kind that moved in the shadows, unseen yet all-encompassing. Now, everyone was fighting for dominance, spilling blood in open confrontations, and letting their presence be known in a world that once revered silence. The reign of whispers had come to an end. The streets that once reverberated with subtle transactions now hummed with gunfire, with the roaring engines of black market deals and the clinking of chains that bound families to a single, bloody cause. But even as new players fought for control, the memory of Carlo's empire lingered like a ghost, watching from the shadows. His influence didn't die with him. It lived on in the undercurrents of every deal, in the quiet nods of old allies who still remembered his cold efficiency. Those who had served him, who had once moved in his quiet orbit, found themselves torn between loyalty to a legacy long gone and the need to adapt to the new, louder world. Some of them clung to the old ways, whispering of Carlo's methods in hushed tones, while others embraced the chaotic freedom that came with the collapse of his order. The city's balance had shifted, but Carlo's absence left a hole that no one could truly fill. Even in death, he cast a long shadow over the new players, a constant reminder of the control that once had been so absolute. There was no clear leader now, no single figure who commanded the same respect or fear that Carlo had once inspired. The city trembled under the weight of competing forces, each one trying to carve its piece of the pie. But they were all just fumbling in the dark, hoping to stumble upon the kind of power that Carlo had wielded with quiet precision. For all their noise, for all their bluster and bloodshed, none of them could escape the fact that the ghost of Carlo Gambino was still present in the city. His empire might have crumbled, but his influence, his method of control, lingered in the underworld, a silent reminder that some men, even in death, they were too dangerous to be forgotten. Carlo Gambino's name became a whispered legend in the dark corners of the underworld, a myth that both haunted and inspired those who followed in his footsteps. His empire, though broken and scattered, was still revered by the young bloods eager to rise. They saw his legacy not as a reminder of a man who had died, but as a tool to be wielded, a banner under which they could rally their forces. To them, Carlo was more than a former Don. He was an ideal, a symbol of silent power, the embodiment of everything they aspired to become. But the myth was a double-edged sword. While it brought respect, it also brought weight. The pressure to live up to what Carlo had built was unbearable for some. His quiet dominance had been the result of years of meticulous planning, patience, and fear, qualities that no amount of ambition could easily replicate. The families who inherited his power found themselves not just carrying his mantle, but constantly comparing themselves to the ghost of the man who had once held it all. The new leaders quickly realized that the myth of Carlo Gambino was as much a burden as a gift. They wielded his name like a weapon, but it was heavy, and it had a way of breaking them. Every decision they made, every move they took, was scrutinized under the harsh light of his legacy. In the shadows, Carlo's name echoed, a constant reminder that silence and strategy had once been the hallmarks of his reign. For those who lacked the same calculating mind, the myth proved to be both their guide and their undoing. And yet, as the next generation of mafiosos tried to control what Carlo once held, they discovered that his empire was not as easily controlled. The streets that had been Carlo's domain were now a battleground. New families, unburdened by the myth, had begun to challenge the Gambino's old territories, seeking to stake their claim where Carlo's presence had once been unchallenged. They didn't fear the old ways, they ignored them, choosing instead to fight in broad daylight, with guns and violence. But even as the new generation clashed, Carlo's influence lingered in the air, unspoken but undeniable. There were those who still remembered his way of doing business quietly, without the flash, without the grand gestures, and they sought to resurrect that control. His tactics became a template for those who were smart enough to recognize that power wasn't just about fighting, it was about surviving. Carlo Gambino may have been gone, but his myth, his ghost, lived on, taking root in the hearts of men who sought his kind of power. And though the new leaders struggled to carry it, they were trapped in the silent shadow he had cast. For some, it would be their downfall. For others, it would be their final triumph. The silence that once served as Carlo Gambino's greatest weapon now felt like a suffocating shroud over his children. Raised in the echo of his name, they had inherited his empire, but also the ghosts of his choices. Their lives were governed by an unspoken rule: speak little, observe more. But silence, they came to understand, had its price. Carlo's children had grown up with the understanding that power was not something to be flaunted. In their father's world, silence was strength. But now, as they navigated the fractured remnants of the Gambino legacy, the weight of that silence began to bear down on them. The fear their father had cultivated, the fear that had once made his name respected and feared in equal measure, lingered long after his fall. It no longer served as a shield, it had become a cage. As the years passed, the family's influence waned, and the fear that had once been their currency turned into a curse. The streets Carlo once ruled were now divided among new players, ruthless, aggressive, and willing to make noise where Carlo had learned to stay quiet. His children tried to follow the path of their father, seeking power in the shadows, but they found that the world had changed. The old ways were no longer enough. Each decision, each silent move, was met with suspicion. People had forgotten how to fear the quiet. They only feared what they could hear. The power that had been built in whispers was now slipping through their fingers, leaving them to watch as the empire they were meant to inherit crumbled around them. For Carlo's children, silence was no longer the foundation of their strength. It was a reminder of what they had lost. They could no longer rely on the unspoken respect their father had commanded. Instead, they found themselves faced with questions and doubts, their every action scrutinized. The empire had unraveled, and the cost of staying silent had become painfully clear. Yet, even in the chaos, there was still something powerful in the legacy of the whispering assassin. Carlo's children were not men and women of words, but they understood that in the world of the mafia, actions spoke louder than anything. Though the empire had been torn apart, the fear remained. It remained in the eyes of the old allies who still whispered his name, in the lingering scent of danger that followed those who once served him. The price of silence had been steep, but it was the price of power. And in the end, Carlo Gambino's name, though no longer a force in the world, still haunted the streets. His children, carrying the weight of his legacy, continued the battle, fighting for a future they could never fully reclaim. And as they did, the shadow of their father lingered, a silent tribute to the man who had built his empire on whispers and whose silence would forever echo in the underworld. The fall of the old guard was not something that happened overnight. It was a slow, inevitable unraveling, one stitch at a time. Carlo Gambino's way of power, quiet, calculating, built on whispers and unseen hands, was a relic now, a distant echo in a world that had moved on. The new generation of the Gambino family had no use for silence. They were hungry for the flashy, violent methods that were taking hold across the streets of New York. They sought instant power, a way to control the city with brute force, with the noise of gunshots rather than the subtlety of manipulation. At first, the old men in the family tried to hold on, clinging to the methods that had served them well under Carlo's reign. But their voices grew weaker, their decisions slower, and the respect they commanded dwindled with each passing day. The younger bloods, fresh-faced and impatient, began to challenge them. They questioned the very foundation Carlo had built, an empire constructed on silence, loyalty, and patience. They wanted more. They wanted dominance. They wanted spectacle. And most importantly, they wanted power now. The younger generation began to tear at the seams of what Carlo had painstakingly crafted. They didn't understand the quiet strength that had made Carlo's rule unshakable. They only saw the vulnerability in his absence, the cracks in the structure that allowed them to rise. They weren't interested in long-term loyalty or the quiet endurance Carlo had embodied. They wanted respect in an instant, something that came with violence and spectacle. They wanted their names in the papers, their actions on the streets, a constant reminder to the city that they were in charge. And so, the old guard faded. The elders, too hesitant to act, were pushed aside by the ambitious, loud voices of the younger generation. The Gambino family, once a whisper in the shadows, now found itself thrown into the open, clashing with rival families who were all too eager to stake their claim. What had once been a carefully controlled empire began to fracture as old loyalties turned to dust. It wasn't just the family that felt the shift. The streets began to change too. Where Carlo's quiet influence had kept a delicate balance, the brash violence of the new generation upset that equilibrium. The city that Carlo had ruled with a careful hand was now flooded with blood and noise. The older families watched as their foundations crumbled, replaced by a chaos they no longer understood. The erosion of Carlo's influence was subtle at first. Small betrayals, quiet power grabs, and the ever-growing presence of the young, hungry men who wanted to lead. But soon, the whispers that had once carried his name in reverence turned to murmurs of uncertainty. The old guard was fading, and with them, the empire Carlo had built. The Gambino family was no longer the feared, silent force it once was. It was now a broken shell, ravaged by the loud, violent hands of a new generation that didn't know how to keep their silence. Carlo Gambino's shadow still stretched across the underworld, despite the cracks in his empire. Even as the new generation of mafiosos abandoned his quiet reign in favor of more brazen displays of power, there were those who remembered the old ways. They remembered the whispered deals, the unseen hand that guided the Gambino family through the chaos of the streets, and they longed for that calm authority once more. These men were few but loyal, a group that still held Carlo's legacy close, believing that the power they had lost could be regained if they could only return to the roots of his silent rule. The underworld had shifted in ways that Carlo could never have predicted. The loud, violent method had become the norm. Bombs, car chases, and showy displays of strength were the language of the new mafia. But there were still whispers among the old guard, quiet meetings in shadowed corners, furtive conversations about reclaiming the lost glory of the Gambino name, about taking back what had been abandoned. The old men who had once served Carlo now felt the sting of betrayal by their own families. They watched as the new generation tore apart what Carlo had built, and they vowed to restore it. They searched, moving like ghosts through the city. Their mission was simple: find Carlo's final notebook. In the hands of the right person, it was said to hold the key to restoring the family to its former glory. This notebook was the stuff of legend, passed down in whispers among those who had served him faithfully. Some said it contained the secrets to navigating the treacherous waters of the underworld. Others believed it was a map to understanding the true power of silence that had once made Carlo an unstoppable force. No one knew exactly what was written inside, but they all believed that it was the blueprint for the family's future. The search for the notebook became more than a mission. It became a quest to revive the very soul of the Gambino family. The men who sought it were not driven by the lust for power, but by the need for redemption. They saw Carlo not as a fallen leader, but as a figure to be worshipped and emulated. If they could unlock the secrets he had left behind, they could resurrect the family's reputation, reclaim its position at the top, and restore the quiet, calculating strength that had once ruled the city. But as the loyalists searched, the world around them continued to change. The old ways of silence and subtlety were becoming harder to maintain. Even if the notebook could be found, they weren't sure the tactics within it would still work in this new, faster-paced world. Still, they pressed on, for they knew that the legacy of Carlo Gambino could never truly die. It lingered in the shadows, waiting for the right men to bring it back to life. The city of New York, still bruised from the passing of Carlo Gambino's reign, carried the weight of his absence like an unspoken truth. The streets whispered his name in hushed tones, and the walls of the underworld trembled with the reverberations of his legacy. In the shadows, rival families vied for power, but none could fill the void he left behind. The fight for dominance, though outwardly chaotic and violent, carried a ghostly undertone, one of respect, fear, and the lingering presence of a king who had ruled with silence as his weapon. The war that brewed in the underworld wasn't just about territory or money, it was about control. Families rose and fell in quick succession, but the memory of Carlo's reign haunted every move they made. In the darkened corners of the city, his name was invoked as both a badge of honor and a threat. Allies and enemies alike spoke of the whispering assassin, invoking his name as a warning or a prayer, depending on which side of the conflict they stood. It was as if the very idea of Carlo Gambino still held power, his ghost steering the actions of men who had never met him, but felt the weight of his legacy pressing down upon them. As the Mafia war intensified, the public began to catch whispers of the man behind the legend. Journalists and former insiders, once too afraid to speak, now found themselves willing to share the untold stories of Carlo Gambino's genius and ruthlessness. The floodgates opened slowly at first, with timid reports that mentioned his name in passing. But as time wore on, more and more came forward. Those who had worked with him, for him, or against him, began to recount the quiet brilliance that had made Carlo a force to be reckoned with. They spoke of a man who never raised his voice, but whose decisions sent ripples through the very fabric of the city. Stories emerged of meetings held in silence, of calculated moves that turned the tide of battles before they even began. Carlo had never needed force. He had controlled with a look, a gesture, and the weight of his reputation. For some, the stories painted him as a ruthless tyrant, a man willing to do whatever it took to maintain his empire. For others, he was a quiet hero, a man who had built his power from the ground up, using only his wits and his ability to understand the delicate balance of fear and loyalty. In truth, the tales reflected both sides of his character, his genius and his brutality, his unwavering control, and his deep understanding of the human psyche. Yet even as the stories grew, one thing remained clear. Carlo Gambino's empire was no longer his. The world had changed, but the echoes of his reign could still be felt. As new players stepped onto the stage, the old king's shadow lingered, a reminder of what once was and what could never be again. The city had never been so alive with tension, yet the air carried a stillness, a quiet hum, like a storm building just out of sight. The new Mafia war was not a spectacle of violence as many had expected. There were no car bombs, no public executions. Instead, it was a war fought in whispers, through subtle manipulations, and by pulling strings from the shadows, an echo of Carlo Gambino's reign. In the underworld, silence had always been the strongest weapon, and now it was being wielded with even more precision than before. Carlo had known that power didn't lie in how loudly one could shout, but in how carefully one could move unseen, unnoticed. His legacy was alive in this new generation of mafia men who studied his methods, revered his tactics, and understood that control came from the unseen, the unspoken. The rival families, once enemies, now found themselves facing a new kind of threat, a leader from within Carlo's circle, someone who had watched and learned, who had waited for this moment to step into the vacuum Carlo's absence had left. This man, once a close ally of Carlo, had taken the lessons of his old mentor and perfected them. He had no interest in the brash displays of power that others favored. His was a silent war, fought with the subtleties of a conversation held behind closed doors, with the steady erosion of trust and the quiet sabotage of every rival move. He was a man who had learned that alliances were meant to be fluid, broken, and reforged when necessary. His ability to manipulate was unmatched, and his control of information became his most deadly tool. Like Carlo, he understood the delicate balance of fear and loyalty, the need to keep everyone just on the edge of suspicion, but never enough to make them act prematurely. His actions were always calculated, measured, and always one step ahead of his enemies, just as Carlo would have orchestrated had he been alive to see it. The city felt the subtle shifts. Deals were made with no fanfare, and loyalties were tested in ways that nobody saw coming. People disappeared without a trace, their fates sealed by silent betrayals. The leaders of the families, the men who once ruled the streets with brute force, now found themselves entangled in a web of whispers and unseen moves. Their power was slipping through their fingers, and they didn't even know who to blame. Every corner of the city, every alley, every bar was a battleground where the silent war unfolded in slow, meticulous precision. Carlo Gambino's ghost lingered, not in the violent bloodshed that others might have expected, but in the quiet manipulation and subtlety that marked the rise of a new order. The city was his once more, though not with the overt gestures of a king, but with the quiet, relentless power of a man who never needed to raise his voice to command it. The silent war had begun, and in the shadows, the new ruler rose. The new dawn felt the weight of Carlo's empire settle upon his shoulders, heavier than he ever expected. At first, it had been a dream, to step into the silence, to command the shadows with the same mastery Carlo had. But now, in the cold hours of the night, it felt like a curse. He had learned the lessons well: patience, discretion, the art of moving unseen. But those teachings had become a burden, a reminder of everything he had to protect. The world Carlo had ruled with such quiet precision had grown louder, more chaotic. The new generation of mafia men didn't share Carlo's subtlety. They craved spectacle, aggression, and dominance. They pushed for open displays of power, for control that could be seen, felt, and feared. It was a new breed of mafia, one that thrived on the flash of guns and the roar of engines, not the quiet whispers that once governed the underworld. The Don, however, was bound by the teachings of Carlo. He knew the value of silence, but silence was growing less powerful in a world where enemies didn't wait in the shadows, they rushed to strike in broad daylight. The once unshakable control Carlo had maintained now seemed fragile, and the Don found himself facing an empire that required more than just patience. It demanded something Carlo had never fully shown him: the ruthlessness of the modern world. Power, the Don realized, wasn't just about knowing how to disappear. It was about knowing when to appear, when to strike, when to make a show of strength. And in the quiet moments when he watched his men bicker over turf or hear rumors of betrayal, he realized that maintaining control was not a passive endeavor. It required constant vigilance, constant action. He had inherited an empire, but it was crumbling, piece by piece, under the pressure of a changing world. Every decision was a tightrope walk between Carlo's legacy and the demands of survival. He couldn't abandon the old ways, not completely, but he also couldn't ignore the fact that the world had moved on. The mafia was no longer just a collection of men in suits whispering over cigars. It was an empire that stretched its fingers into every facet of life, from politics to business to media. To hold power now, the Don had to adapt. And adapting meant fighting battles he had never prepared for, battles of visibility, of fear, of reputation. The future of the family was now tied to his ability to blend Carlo's quiet methods with the harsher realities of a world that demanded bloodshed and spectacle. The price of power was high, and for the first time since he inherited Carlo's empire, the Don felt unsure. He had learned the art of silence, but silence alone would not keep the wolves at bay. He had to learn to fight without losing his soul. Whispers began to surface in the underworld, soft at first, like a distant echo of a man who had long been thought dead. Carlo Gambino's death had been widely accepted, a clean end to the reign of a ruthless Don. But as the years passed, cracks began to form in the story. Something didn't sit right. Some said the body had been too well hidden, that the final shot was too precise, too perfect. The streets buzzed with rumors. Had Carlo truly died, or had he staged his death, slipping into the shadows once more? It wasn't the old enemies or the rival families who first began to question the truth. It was those who had been closest to him, the men who had known the weight of his silence and felt the power of his control. A secret group of Carlo's former associates, some loyal, others with more selfish motivations, began to meet in the dead of night. They didn't speak of their suspicions openly, but they didn't need to. The looks exchanged in hidden rooms, the barely audible mutterings in back alleys, were enough. Carlo's death was a mystery, and it gnawed at them, pulling them deeper into the search for the truth. What if the Don had faked his death? What if he was still out there, watching, waiting, controlling from the shadows as he always had? These men had been part of Carlo's empire. They understood his mind. The possibility that Carlo might still be alive was enough to reignite their drive. He was a man who had been able to disappear before, who had mastered the art of the unseen. And if he had somehow orchestrated his own exit, then his final move was still out there, hidden, waiting to be discovered. The search became an obsession. Old contacts were reached out to, former associates were questioned, and each lead was pursued with the same quiet precision Carlo had once used to build his empire. The danger of the hunt was real. If anyone caught wind of their intentions, their lives would be forfeit. But for these men, the potential of discovering Carlo's final secret, the power he had left behind, was worth any risk. They started to believe that Carlo hadn't simply disappeared. He had planned for this moment. The whispering assassin, the man who had moved unnoticed through the world, might have left behind a legacy even more profound than anyone had imagined. His disappearance, they thought, could be his last brilliant move, a game of power that would outlast even his death. And so, the hunt began in earnest, one that would take them deeper into the underworld than they ever thought possible. Carlo's final move, his true legacy, was still out there. Whoever found it would hold the key to restoring, or reshaping, the balance of power in a world that still feared the name Gambino. The silence that had once defined the Gambino family began to crack, splintered by the harsh echoes of betrayal. It came quietly at first, like a whisper too soft to hear but too sharp to ignore. One of Carlo's closest lieutenants, a man who had been in the fold for decades, decided to turn his back on the family. It wasn't greed or anger that drove him to betray Carlo's legacy, but something darker: ambition. He had grown tired of living in the shadows, tired of operating in the quiet spaces where power was hidden in silence. He wanted the spectacle, the violence, the attention. And so, he made a deal with a rival family, a choice that would set off a chain of events none could have anticipated. As soon as the betrayal was discovered, it unleashed a wave of chaos. The streets, which had once felt like a canvas for quiet moves and measured strikes, were now stained with blood. Carlo's old way of doing things, calculated, methodical, silent, was suddenly irrelevant. The new breed of mafiosos, young men hungry for power and eager for recognition, came crashing in. They weren't interested in whispers or subtlety. They wanted bloodshed. They wanted wars with sirens and headlines, not negotiations and shadows. They fought with the kind of violence Carlo had always avoided, and with each confrontation, the family's hold on the city grew weaker. The old guard, those who had learned under Carlo's tutelage, found themselves torn. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was a direct challenge to the very essence of how the Gambino family had operated for so long. The ghosts of Carlo's tactics, his control through silence, his ability to make moves without anyone noticing, haunted them in those moments of desperation. The family had always thrived on discretion, but now it was being torn apart by those who wanted to make a show of their power. The halls of power in the Gambino family had become a battleground. Those loyal to the old ways, those who still respected the art of the quiet strike, fought to maintain control, but it was a losing battle. Each new conflict chipped away at the family's foundation, as blood spilled in the streets and trust fractured in the boardrooms. The power of silence, the very thing that had kept the Gambino family at the top for so long, was slipping away, replaced by spectacle and violence. In the end, the betrayal didn't just threaten to tear the family apart, it changed everything. The silent reign of Carlo Gambino, the man who had once controlled New York without ever raising his voice, seemed like a distant memory. The new generation, with their thirst for power and their hunger for recognition, was taking over. And the whispers that once defined the family's strength now felt like the ghosts of a forgotten time. The room was heavy with the weight of years spent in the shadows, and for the first time in decades, it felt like the ghosts of Carlo's past were present in every corner. His former allies, those who had once followed his silent lead without question, gathered around the old, weathered table. The very table where countless decisions had been made with nothing but a few quiet words. Now, the air was thick with unspoken tension, as if even the walls knew the empire was slipping away from them. They were men of power, but none of them felt it now. Their hands trembled slightly as they reached for their drinks, their faces lined with the hard truth of how far they had fallen. Carlo was gone, and with him went the steady hand that had guided them. Now, in his absence, they were left with nothing but the wreckage of his empire and the haunting question of what came next. One by one, they spoke, but their words held little weight. They spoke of Carlo's legacy, of the way he had shaped their world with silence and precision. There was no need for grand gestures with Carlo. He had never needed to shout to command respect. The quiet genius of his methods had been their guide. But in the wake of his death, the world had changed. The streets no longer respected silence. Power now came in loud bursts of violence and spectacle. Carlo's old ways seemed like relics of a bygone era, and none of them knew how to move forward with that knowledge gnawing at them. Some spoke of their mistakes, the way they had followed Carlo blindly, never questioning the very silence that had made him legendary. They had believed it was enough to live in the shadows, to make their moves without anyone noticing. But now they understood the cost of that silence, the cost of never acknowledging the darkness that had been growing at the edges of their empire. In Carlo's world, there had been loyalty, yes, but also fear. Fear of what came when you were too quiet for too long. Fear of the new power that rose, driven by the desire for visibility, for dominance, for something more than just survival. The room grew colder as the conversation shifted, and the inevitable truth began to sink in. The Gambino family, Carlo's family, was no longer a united front. The divide between old loyalties and the rising power of a new generation was impossible to ignore. The men around the table had been the architects of his empire, but they couldn't hold it together. Not now, not without him. An air of inevitability hung over the room, as if each of them understood that they could never live up to the genius of Carlo Gambino. His silent reign had been impossible to replicate, and now, with the weight of his absence pressing down on them, they had no answers. Only silence, broken only by the occasional shuffle of papers, the clink of glass, and the soft rustle of ghosts long past. The search for Carlo's notebook began as a whisper, passing from one trusted ally to the next, until it was a secret too dangerous to ignore. The group that formed around it was small, a mix of old loyalty and new ambition, each member driven by their own desire to see the Gambino family restored, or in some cases, to seize the power that Carlo had once held with such quiet certainty. They all believed that the notebook held the key to an empire, a series of plans and strategies that Carlo had crafted in the shadows, his final testament to his genius. The men who now sought it knew that Carlo's death had left more than just an absence. It had left a void, a vacuum in which the family had faltered, and in their desperation, they clung to the hope that the answers were hidden somewhere in that small, elusive book. The notebook was rumored to contain details of Carlo's grand vision, a blueprint not only for the family's survival, but for domination. It was said to be filled with methods of power grabs, alliances, and ways to neutralize enemies without ever firing a shot. It was the essence of Carlo himself, written down and locked away, possibly waiting for the right person to unlock its secrets. They ventured into the heart of Carlo's old empire, retracing his steps, visiting the old haunts, the back rooms where decisions were made in silence. But the further they dug, the more elusive it became. Every lead was a false hope, every clue a distraction. It was as if Carlo had anticipated this search and had planned for it, leaving behind nothing but shadows. The men began to question whether the notebook had ever existed at all, or if it had been nothing more than a myth spun by the very man who had made silence his weapon. The tension among the group grew with each dead end. They were forced to confront the ghosts of their past, the choices they had made under Carlo's reign, and the loyalty they had once held so dear. But now, that loyalty was being tested. Some saw the notebook as a way back to the power they had lost, while others feared that its discovery would only bring more bloodshed, another cycle of violence they couldn't escape. As they dug deeper into the heart of Carlo's world, they uncovered not just secrets, but old scars, betrayals that had been buried long ago, and ambitions that had been simmering beneath the surface. The closer they got to the truth, the more they realized that finding the notebook might not restore the family. It could tear them apart once and for all. The hunt for Carlo's final move became not just a search for power, but a race against time to understand the legacy they had inherited. The ghosts of Carlo Gambino's empire would not rest quietly, and neither would they. The air was thick with anticipation as the Gambino family sat in silence, the shadows of their past and present swirling around them. They had reached the precipice of something bigger than they had ever known, a deal that could reshape the course of their history, one that could end the civil war that had torn the family apart for so long. It was a deal with an outside entity, a force that neither side could ignore, a rival cartel with its own reach, or perhaps an unspoken agreement with a government agency, one that had been working quietly in the shadows for years. The gravity of the situation wasn't lost on anyone. The silent strategies, the unspoken rules that had governed their actions for so long, were about to be tested in ways that Carlo Gambino had never faced. His principles of silence, of moving through the world unseen, would need to be wielded with precision. The negotiations were set to occur in a place far removed from the public eye, a room hidden deep within a network of allies and informants, each playing their part in an intricate dance of power. The family's survival depended on the success of this deal, but there was a cost to making such a bargain, one that would echo through the underworld for years to come. The first steps were always the quietest, but now there would be no room for hesitation, no time for second thoughts. The question was simple. Could the new generation, one that had learned from Carlo's whispers, execute this deal as seamlessly as he had? Could they blend fear and respect, secrecy and ambition to control what was slipping further away from their grasp? As they entered the room where the deal was to take place, the same tension that had accompanied Carlo's negotiations years ago seemed to hang in the air. Only now, there was a sharper edge to it. The participants were seasoned, hungry, and willing to fight for what they wanted, no matter the cost. There would be no open displays of violence, no loud threats, but there was an unspoken promise of retribution for any move that crossed the line. The new leadership took their place at the table, their eyes focused, calculating. They had learned the art of Carlo's silence, but it was now their turn to turn it into action. They spoke in soft tones, carefully crafted words that had weight beyond their syllables. Every move was deliberate, every gesture loaded with meaning. The room felt like a pressure cooker, the walls pressing in as the stakes grew higher with each passing moment. It wasn't just a deal for power. It was a deal that could erase their enemies or set them on a path from which they might never return. In that darkened room, Carlo's methods lived on. Fear, respect, and silence swirled like a toxic cloud, and the Gambino family, now fully aware of what they had to lose, made their final play. Whether it was a victory or defeat, no one would know until the dust had settled. But one thing was clear: their grip on the city, like Carlo's reign, was built on a foundation of whispers and shadows, a dangerous game in which silence was the most potent weapon of all. A figure emerged from the shadows of Carlo Gambino's legacy, someone who had watched the empire rise and fall from the periphery. A distant relative, a protege perhaps, who had spent years in the quiet corridors of the underworld, learning the ways of the old master. But now, with the family fractured and the power slipping through their fingers, this new force would rise, an embodiment of Carlo's ideals, yet adapted to the changing world of violence and chaos. Where Carlo had relied on whispers, this new figure was more overt, a figure who had understood the importance of silence, but also recognized that the world was no longer waiting for anyone. The rules had shifted. The mafia was no longer built on old-school loyalty but on cold calculation and brutality. This new assassin had honed Carlo's methods, but injected them with a ruthlessness that could no longer afford to be invisible. He wasn't a shadow like Carlo had been, but a storm that brewed quietly before striking without warning. He was everything Carlo had been, yet more efficient, more adaptable, more willing to bend the silence into a weapon of terror. Where Carlo had kept his enemies guessing, this new figure made them feel the weight of his presence before they even knew it was coming. The city had changed, and so had the men who sought to control it. The old codes no longer held the same power. Now it was about taking what you wanted with no hesitation, leaving nothing behind but a trail of bodies and broken alliances. As the new assassin moved through the streets, his name became a whisper, a promise of death in the eyes of his enemies. He wasn't just a man of silence. He was the storm that followed. Every move, calculated. Every betrayal, swift and inevitable. He saw Carlo's empire as something to be built upon, not revered, and he was intent on expanding what the old Don had left behind. His enemies knew that the same fear that had been instilled by Carlo now breathed in his wake. Only this time, it was colder, sharper, and more lethal. He started with the smallest of plays, picking off rivals one by one, dismantling their networks with precision. But every move he made was more than just about eliminating the competition. It was about sending a message. He wanted the city to know that Carlo's shadow had never truly left. It had simply morphed into something new. This was the future, and the new assassin was determined to solidify his reign over the city, marking it with his brand of fear. But with every step he took, every enemy he erased, the same question loomed. Could anyone truly escape the shadows that had once followed Carlo Gambino? Or was he, too, destined to become a ghost in the end, his empire eventually slipping from his grasp as all others had before him? The streets of New York, once Carlo Gambino's kingdom, buzzed with an uneasy energy. Whispers began to spread like wildfire, slowly at first, then picking up speed, until they became undeniable. Someone had returned. Someone who should have been lost to the past, but whose name was spoken again, in hushed tones, in corners of the city where even the bravest feared to tread. This figure wasn't just a relic. They were a direct link to the heart of Carlo's empire and, more importantly, to his death. The return of this person, a ghost from Carlo's past, was unexpected. No one had anticipated it, but there they were, moving in silence, carrying with them an aura of mystery and something far more dangerous, the truth. A truth that threatened to unravel everything Carlo had spent a lifetime building. For years, The family had believed they knew the story of Carlo's fall. His death was a whispered myth, a tale passed down like a secret coded into the veins of the family. But the truth, buried somewhere in the darkest corners of Carlo's world, had always been elusive. This figure, this once trusted ally, held the key to it all, and with their return came the potential to either redeem the family or push it toward its final demise. In the murky underworld of the mafia, no one truly left. People disappeared for a while, yes, but they always had a way of finding their way back. And now, the resurfacing of this person carried the weight of every unspoken promise, every silent contract, every betrayal. They knew the truth about Carlo's death. They had seen what others had missed, the quiet decisions that led to the final confrontation, the subtle moves made in shadows that no one had been aware of at the time. With their return, old wounds reopened. The family, already fractured, began to feel the pressure. Was Carlo's death truly what they had been told? Had he really planned for the end of his reign, or had he been caught in a trap of his own making? As the figure moved through the family's ranks, like a specter walking through a long-forgotten dream, the past and present collided. Confrontations became inevitable. The family's leaders, desperate to maintain their grip, sought answers, but the answers were never easy. The truth, when finally revealed, was far more complex than anyone could have imagined. It wasn't just about Carlo's death. It was about the choices he had made, the deals he'd struck, and the silent wars he had waged behind closed doors. And now, as the figure from his past stood in the light, the final secret of Carlo's legacy was about to come to light. In the quiet return of this figure lay the possibility of redemption, or the final, unforgiving collapse of the empire that Carlo Gambino had once ruled. The Gambino family had never been this fragmented. What was once an empire built on Carlo Gambino's quiet precision was now a collection of struggling factions, each one grasping at the remnants of power. The streets that Carlo had once ruled with a cold, methodical hand now felt different. There was no longer the unshakable certainty that had once silenced opposition. The air was thick with uncertainty, and whispers of Carlo's final move began to circulate, like embers from a fire that had never quite been extinguished. Betrayals had cut deep, old loyalties were shattered, replaced by new alliances forged in desperation. The power vacuum left in the wake of Carlo's death had invited more players into the game, but none with the same restraint that had once defined the Gambino name. The new generation, hungry for spectacle and dominance, had traded the old ways for flashier methods. Yet beneath the surface, the pull of Carlo's legacy remained. His teachings, his quiet strategy, still clung to the family's bones like an unspoken oath, even as the world around them shifted. But in the shadows, the family clung to one last hope, the secret of Carlo's final move. There were rumors, but no one had ever truly understood what that last stroke of genius might have been. Was it a hidden alliance, a final betrayal, or perhaps something deeper, more subtle, something designed to ensure that his empire would not simply die with him? As the family scrambled to regain control, they began to realize that Carlo had orchestrated everything, even after his death. It was his old-school silence, the quiet manipulation of events, that had set the stage for the final act. Each small betrayal, each new alliance, had been a piece of a much larger plan that no one had noticed. Carlo had always been a master of influence without ever showing his hand, and even in death, his shadow loomed large over the family's every move. The pieces of his plan, scattered across the city like fragments of a shattered mirror, were beginning to align. The family was, unknowingly, following the path that Carlo had laid for them years before. In the final showdown, Carlo's legacy, his silence, his ruthless efficiency, was the key. His final move had been so carefully crafted that even those closest to him never saw it coming. As the family prepared for their last battle, they were unaware that Carlo had already decided the outcome. His influence, stretching far beyond the grave, had orchestrated this moment. It was not the end of the Gambino family, but a turning point, a moment of reckoning. And in the stillness of it all, Carlo's last whisper, silent, as always, echoed through the streets. The empire would live on, but not as it once was. The dust had settled, but the damage was irrevocable. The final confrontation had left the Gambino family in ruins, their power scattered like shattered glass across the streets they once dominated. The walls of their empire, once fortified by Carlo Gambino's quiet cunning, now stood as hollow monuments to what had been. The heirs of his legacy, those few who had survived the chaos, found themselves adrift in a world that had moved on. The city that had once feared their name now barely remembered it, and the shadows they had once ruled no longer whispered in their favor. Those who remained, battered and broken, were forced to confront a simple truth. Carlo Gambino, the man who had controlled the city with a silence that spoke louder than any gunshot, was gone. His empire, built on whispers and manipulation, had crumbled in a final, catastrophic rush, leaving behind only ghosts of past decisions, of old alliances, and of a power that no longer existed. The men who had once stood at the top, wielding power with the ease of a master, now found themselves in a struggle for survival, not in the streets, but in the quiet moments of reflection. In the aftermath, there was no grand celebration, no moment of triumph to mark the end of the war. Instead, there was an eerie stillness that settled over the survivors, a silence so profound that it felt like a weight pressing down on their chests. They had won the war, but the cost was unimaginable. Those who had been loyal to Carlo, who had carried out his orders without question, now stood in the shadow of his absence, wondering if the silence that had once been a symbol of their power could ever be filled again. Could anyone truly fill the void left by the whispering assassin? Carlo's legacy was a strange thing to inherit. There were no grand monuments, no public displays of wealth or success. Instead, there was only the quiet, a quiet that came with the understanding that power wasn't just in what was said, but in what was never spoken. It was in the ability to move through the world unseen, to control the narrative without ever having to speak a word. And as the surviving members of the family walked the empty streets, they were forced to face the reality that they were no longer the silent rulers of this world. They were simply men, left to carry the weight of a legacy they could never fully understand. The city, now quieter than it had been in years, moved on. But for those who remembered Carlo, there was always the lingering question: can anyone truly fill the silence left behind by the man who had ruled from the shadows? The streets may have returned to their routine, but the memory of Carlo Gambino, the whispering assassin, would never fade completely. It lingered like an unanswered question, hanging in the air, unspoken, but ever present. And in that silence, the legacy of the man who had ruled in whispers endured, even after everything else had fallen away.